It's just days before Operation Overlord, better known in the history books as D-Day. Over 1 million men from 5 different nations will simultaneously launch several landings across the French coast, a military operation the likes of which has never been attempted before. Waiting across the English Channel are several 100,000 German defenders, sitting in heavily fortified bunkers, overseeing beaches littered with mines, barbed wire, and concrete tank traps. Hitler and his generals know that an invasion is coming. Up until now, the war has been largely Britain fighting for her life, with the Soviets in the Far East being easily defeated. The Americans have conducted several operations in northern Africa with very mixed success, but now the bulk of their forces are finally in Britain, eager to join the fight. Any day now, the true battle of Europe will begin, and the Germans hold all the advantages. Suddenly, German radio operators begin picking up radio chatter from American and British units. The operators are quick to identify several of the Allied units broadcasting, including several American and British infantry divisions, armored divisions, and even General Patton's headquarters itself. The alarm is immediately raised. Something big is going down, and soon. The Luftwaffe is ordered to put recon planes up into the air, and as they make the short trip across the channel, they take photos of column after column of tanks, trucks, and artillery, all lined up and ready to board landing craft. German Army headquarters is immediately alerted to the pending invasion, and General Rommel himself orders reinforcements to rush to Calais, directly across from the preparing invaders. He even commits the bulk of his armor reserve to the area. The Allies must not be allowed to gain so much as a toehold on Europe. They must be met directly on the beach and thrown back into the ocean. Another reconnaissance flight over the massing forces is ordered, and the pilot confirms the locations of the Allied forces, reporting thousands of armored vehicles and trucks waiting to be loaded. As the plane turns around from overflying the massed troops, a stiff wind suddenly picks up, and one of the tanks starts to float away. Hurrying, a soldier ducks out from under a tent and rushes to the tank, tying it down with a rope and securing it from the stiff breeze. Luckily, the German plane seems to have taken no notice of the peculiar incident. As Germany prepares to defeat the largest invasion in military history, there's just one problem. The American and British tanks and other vehicles are all made of rubber, barely more than inflatable balloons. The giant invasion army is fake, a ploy engineered by the British and carried out with the help of the US's 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. And the real invasion force is massing right now for a landing dozens of miles away in Normandy, known as the Ghost Army. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was a military outfit like no other. Its members were men specifically recruited from the world of advertisement, visual arts of all sorts, carpenters, and talented actors. Their job was simple: fool the Germans by pretending to be something they were not, and the 1,100-strong unit was tasked with staging elaborate displays that would make the Germans believe they were facing a much larger threat than they really were, making use of inflatable tanks, rubber airplanes, and plywood artillery. Officially known as tactical deception, this elite troop of soldiers would be critical in confusing and confounding the German military throughout the course of the war. The Ghost Army ultimately staged 20 battlefield deceptions between 1944 and 1945. Their performances, or illusions, as the members insisted on calling their cunning tricks, would often take place within just a few hundred yards of enemy lines, putting them in just as much risk as any regular soldier. Yet, unlike regular soldiers, if the enemy didn't fall for the trick, they might be left with nothing more than rubber tanks to fight with. In order to fool the Germans, the Ghost Army created something called atmosphere, a term familiar to any theater or film artist. In essence, atmosphere simply means creating a believable tone or impression for the audience, and in this case, the audience was German military units and undercover spies. To do this, the members of the Ghost Army would wear uniforms from different military units and make sure they were seen marching by enemy scouts. The scouts would then return back to their headquarters and report that members of a specific unit were operating in the local area, while the real unit, along with all its firepower, was in actuality somewhere else entirely. This would lead the Germans to deploy their forces to defend from imaginary threats, fearing for instance an attack by an American armored division, when in reality that same division was preparing to attack somewhere else far away. To help sell the illusion though, the soldiers of the Ghost Army would drive trucks or tanks, sometimes as few as just 2, in constant looping convoys, creating the illusion of a much larger unit being transported to the front lines. The clever actors would also learn to impersonate radio operators from different units, mimicking not just their voice, but also the way that they sent Morse code messages, down to every minute idiosyncrasy of the specific operator. All these tiny details would add up to a very convincing deception, leaving the Germans utterly confused as to the real state of affairs across the combat front. Ghost army soldiers would also put their acting talents to use in person, often spending time at French cafes near the war front, where they knew they would be overheard by German spies. The soldiers would wear uniforms of different infantry or armored divisions, again sowing confusion as to the true location of the real units. And they would talk loudly and openly about upcoming tactical operations. Commensurate actors, the Ghosters would learn their roles well, playing everything from overexcited new recruits eager to see their first combat and accidentally spilling operational secrets, to even high-ranking generals bragging about upcoming operations to pretty waitresses, while knowing that a German spy would certainly be within earshot. Sometimes, though, it was just enough to be seen and not heard, and soldiers would often parade around pretending to be very high-ranking Allied officers, making German spies believe that major operations must be about to take place in areas where no such operations were being planned. If you've ever acted in a school play and thought it was nerve-wracking, imagine trying to play the part of a very high-ranking officer in World War II, knowing that your performance could save or doom thousands of lives. Ghost Army soldiers used every range of their artistic talent in the fight to liberate Europe, and this included audio engineers. Today, you might hole yourself up in a room with some music software and cook up some sick beats to get a few likes on Facebook. But for the soldiers of the Ghost Army, creating convincing mixtapes made up of the sounds of different vehicles and tanks could mean the difference between life and death. These soldiers worked in conjunction with Bell Labs back in Fort Knox and recorded dozens of different types of military vehicles, everything from tanks to trucks and even jeeps. The recordings were written directly into wire recorders, bleeding-edge technology at the time, and then transported to the battlefields of Europe. A modern DJ may have to mix different tracks together to entertain an audience, but in World War II, the Ghost Army's own DJs would be tasked with mixing all the different recordings of armored vehicles to create a realistic soundscape of an advancing army. If the recordings or the mixing just wasn't right, the entire ploy could collapse, and Ghost Army soldiers had to do this with primitive equipment mounted on the back of a half-track loaded with giant speakers. No doubt a difficult task. The tactic was nevertheless effective in fooling the Germans several times, and the recordings could be heard as far away as 15 miles, giving the impression of a very large force moving through the thick woods of Europe's forests. Another brainchild of the Ghost Army was spoof radio, and it used actors impersonating radio operators from other units. They would do everything from report fake troop movements to even calling in fake radio reports from imaginary combat zones, complete with a soundscape of battlefield noises to make the performance believable. Thus, German units might be fooled into thinking that American forces were retreating by picking up the broadcast of a panicked soldier calling for a retreat, when in actuality the forces were digging in to lure the Germans into a trap, or weren't even in the area at all. The fake battlefield broadcasts also confused the Germans, making them believe that their own units, which were not engaged in battle, had been engaged. Confused German commanders would be forced to contact individual units to try and clear the fog of war, leaving opportunities for Allied troops to act before the Germans could properly react. Spoof radio was so successful that it even fooled Axis Sally, otherwise known as Mildred Gillars, an American woman turned Nazi propagandist. She would go on to report that an entire Allied division was preparing for battle at a place with no troops at all. Ghost Army soldiers would often protect other soldiers in a much more active way though. During D-Day and several other major operations, Ghost Army artists created realistic-looking decoys that became tempting bombing and artillery targets for the Germans. This would include artillery emplacements, fake landing barges, and groups of parked vehicles. The elaborate displays would sometimes even be lit up with lights, as if someone was being accidentally careless, making them that much more tempting for the Germans to strike at. Attacks on these fake military positions saved countless Allied lives. Sometimes, though, ghost soldiers would simply mirror pre-existing positions, such as artillery sites, diverting fire from the real emplacement and once more saving lives. As the fight for Europe moved to the east, so too did the Ghost Army. In September, after the D-Day landings, the Ghost Army impersonated the entirety of the 6th Armored Division, effectively plugging a gap in General Patton's assault on the French city of Metz. German forces looked for a vulnerability to exploit and instead were faced with a continuous line of American forces, leaving them no room to outmaneuver the American advance. Had the Germans not fallen for the ruse, they would certainly have broken through the American lines and flanked the real attack by General Patton, potentially dooming the entire assault. Imagine being the German general who would learn later after the war that rubber tanks were what defeated him in one of the pivotal battles for Europe. Yet, as impressive as the Ghost Army's deceptions were up to this point, one of their greatest illusions would take place toward the end of the war. In March 1945, Allied forces were preparing to cross the Rhine River, and at last into the heart of Germany itself. Victory was within sight, if they could just get across the very heavily fortified Rhine. Any attempt to cross would be bloody, with casualties projected in the tens of thousands, and yet the attack was necessary to finally bring an end to World War II. The Ghost Army would play their part in the attack, and were tasked with the incredible job of simulating 2 entire infantry divisions, or about 20,000 men and all their equipment, with just 1,100 soldiers. The Ghost Army would set upon the impossible task with gusto, calling on every ounce of artistic creativity to fool the Germans into believing the main assault across the Rhine would come far away from the actual attack. To do this, they ran a mounting concert of radio broadcasts, simulating troop movements and orders between different brigade and division commanders, a performance that convinced the Germans real units were moving into the area. Across the river, the Ghost Army blasted its carefully mixed soundtrack of troops, vehicles, and heavy equipment, making sentries posted along the Rhine believe that just across the river from them, the illusionary divisions were preparing for an attack. The deceit worked perfectly, and incredibly, when the real American units made their crossing of the Rhine, they encountered little, if any, resistance, laying bare Germany's heart. The Ghost Army is credited with saving tens of thousands of lives and helping ensure victory in World War II. Its soldiers were certainly cut from a different cloth, being professional and amateur actors, painters, and artists of all sorts, and bringing their incredible talents to their nation's aid in one of the darkest times in modern history. Their contribution to victory, however, is likely best immortalized in the results of the D-Day invasions, when even as the main assault force was making landfall in Normandy, the Germans refused to send reinforcements, believing the real attack to be a diversion for the fake attack by rubber tanks waiting for them across the channel. Hitler, a man so evil he ruined an entire mustache style. If anyone deserved to die, this man was it. Here's the craziest ways history's most notorious villain was almost rubbed out. Bad schnitzel. Way back when Hitler was first embarking into politics, some brave citizen heard Hitler speak and smelled trouble for Germany. This prompted the unknown individual or group of individuals to try and eliminate Hitler before it was too late. As Hitler and his staff had dinner at the Hotel Kaiserhof in Berlin, they shortly after became seriously ill. Poisoning was immediately suspected, but alas, whoever carried out the assassination attempt failed to realize that Hitler was a vegetarian and thus was spared. Next time a vegan tries to tell you meat is murder, remind them that vegetables basically killed over 40 million people in World War II. The pen is mightier than the sword, especially if it's poisoned. It takes a special kind of man for people to want to kill you twice in the same year. In February of 1932, Ludwig Assner, a member of the Bavarian State Parliament, didn't exactly like the cut of Hitler's jib. He penned a poisoned letter to Hitler, but an acquaintance of Assner's spilled the tea and the letter was intercepted. Mercenary death. In 1934, Hitler had been named Chancellor of Germany, but not everyone was triumphantly throwing up their arms in Nazi salutes. In fact, many political and military leaders were extremely wary of Hitler and his Nazi government. To solve this little problem, Hitler kicked off what would become known as the Night of the Long Knives, a series of political killings that effectively eliminated or silenced any opposition to Hitler. Beppo Romer, a member of a German mercenary unit, vowed revenge. He and a group of men made plans to kill Hitler, but sadly the Gestapo would catch on to the plot before any real progress had been made. Sometimes crazy can take care of crazy, or at least try to. Murder from within. When Romer failed to kill Hitler, Helmut Milius, a member of the right-wing radical small-class party, took matters into his own hand. Under his direction, 160 men infiltrated the SS in order to conduct secret surveillance on Hitler. Milius quickly learned Hitler's schedule and daily routines, allowing him to plot the perfect time to kill him. Yet again, the Gestapo, who we have to admit was super on the ball, discovered the plot and put a stop to it. Milius managed to avoid any serious punishment due to the influence of German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, who would go on to be one of Germany's best generals in the Second World War. Allegiance to country, not a man. A year later, a group of government officials from the German Foreign Office knew that they had to act to prevent a disaster. They weren't buying Hitler's Make Germany Great Again and insisted that Hitler was leading the company to disaster, not a resurgence of her glorious imperial days. They knew they had to do something to save the nation they loved, even if it meant killing the man who now ruled it. The group attempted to drum up support with a letter where they penned, "The oath of allegiance to Hitler has lost its meaning since he's ready to sacrifice Germany." Sadly, the plot never took off and the world hurtled ever forward into global war. Explosive briefcases. By 1936, Hitler had whipped up hatred for Jews across much of Germany, and German Jew Helmut Hirsch knew he had to act. He filled 2 suitcases with explosives with a plan to plant them inside the Nazi Party headquarters in Nuremberg. Unfortunately, a Gestapo informant learned of the plot and Hirsch was discovered. Pronounced guilty, Hirsch was executed via beheading, a far better fate than many of his fellow Jews would suffer in the years to come. Back to the crazy though, our next assassin thought he could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Crazy killer. You know you're a terrible person when even insane people want you dead. That's exactly what happened in November of 1937, when mental patient Joseph Thomas traveled all the way to Berlin to shoot Hitler. However, Thomas also had a beef with the Nazi head of the Air Force, Hermann Göring, and plotted to assassinate both on the same day. Discovered by police, Thomas spilled the beans on himself, putting an end to the plot. Interestingly enough, it may have been a good thing that Göring was in fact not killed by Thomas. In the build-up to the war, under Göring's direction, the Luftwaffe did not add any significant number of long-range heavy bombers to its fleet, a move that would haunt Germany during the Battle of England, as it was forced to attack with light and medium bombers only. Further, Göring's inflated ego assured Hitler that his Luftwaffe would be able to keep German troops under siege in Russia supplied, and thus Hitler did not dispatch ground forces to relieve them. This strategic blunder would spell disaster for over 100,000 German soldiers, and for the war effort against the Soviet Union. That one time the Allies saved Hitler's life. Yeah, you heard that right. The same Allies that Hitler would go on to nearly crush saved Hitler's life just before the war began. In September of 1938, conservatives in the German army feared what a renewed war against the Western Allies might do to the nation. They could smell disaster on the horizon, despite all the Nazi propaganda to the contrary. They vowed to enact a coup the moment Hitler declared war on Czechoslovakia, eliminating Hitler and placing the exiled Wilhelm II back on the throne as emperor. Much to their astonishment, Britain and France agreed to the annexation of the Sudetenland in a bid to appease Hitler, and thus the risk of war was temporarily removed. The group nixed their plans to replace Hitler, for the time being. That wouldn't be the last time the Allies saved Hitler's life. But next is an assassin who wanted to kill Hitler for pretty wild reasons. Killing Hitler in order to make Russia great again? Maurice Bavaud was a Swiss theology student and a member of an anti-communist group in France. The group's leader, Marcel Gerbohe, convinced Bavaud and others that he was in fact a member of the Romanov dynasty who had escaped execution at the hands of the dirty Bolsheviks. In fact, Gerbohe was full of Bolshevik himself, but that didn't stop him from convincing Bavaud that if he murdered Hitler, it would somehow help end communism in Russia and the Romanovs could retake the country for themselves. As if that would be much better. Bavaud traveled to Germany in 1938 and bought a pistol, then remarked to a policeman how he'd like to meet Hitler personally. The police officer suggested he travel to Munich for the anniversary of the 1923 beer hall putsch, which Hitler attended every year. Bavaud bought himself a ticket to the event on the reviewing stand and posed as a reporter, prepared to bust a cap the moment Hitler strolled by. Unfortunately, Bavaud aborted the attempt as Hitler was in company of other Nazis that Bavaud didn't want to accidentally injure, which makes about as much sense to us as it does to you. Bavaud now used the last remaining bit of his money to purchase expensive stationery and forged a letter of introduction under the name of French nationalist leader and friend to the Nazi, Pierre Titonji. He took the letter with the hopes of using it to gain an audience with Hitler to Berchtesgaden, but Hitler had decided to remain in Munich. Broke and destitute, Bavaud was forced to stow away on a train to Paris, but was discovered by the conductor. Interrogated by the Gestapo, who again were seriously on the ball, Bavaud admitted to the assassination plot and was executed. Hitler's abundant and incredible luck. Back in World War I, Hitler narrowly avoided being exploded after the exact spot he'd been standing in just moments prior became ground zero for a British artillery round. The explosive luck, get it, would last well into Hitler's life and pay off yet again in October 1939. On a victory parade of Warsaw after Hitler's conquest of Poland, Polish Army General Michael Karasowicz Tokarewski hatched a plan to blow Hitler sky high with explosives buried under his parade route. In a stroke of insane luck, Hitler's parade was diverted at the last minute and completely avoided the planted explosives. And because life is 100% not fair, history's biggest a-hole also happened to be history's luckiest man. Even more explosive luck. Just a month after being nearly blown up, Hitler was once again nearly blown up. For weeks, German carpenter George Elser planned the construction of a timed bomb inside one of Germany's largest beer halls, where he knew Der Führer would soon be making his annual speech in commemoration of the beer hall putsch. The bomb was planted just a few feet away from where Hitler would eventually stand, its timer muffled by a cork. The bomb was timed to go off right in the middle of Hitler's speech, but with World War II on his mind, Hitler cut his speech off early and rushed back to Berlin to convene with his military leaders. Instead of Hitler, the bomb killed 8 others and injured over 60, with the ceiling collapsing right where Hitler had been standing. The subsequent crackdown by the Gestapo made the components needed to create explosives so difficult that multiple other assassination attempts in the works had to be canceled after the organizers were unable to get their hands on the needed explosives. If you fail, try again. In 1939, Beppo Romer was released from prison for his 1934 attempt to murder Hitler. Apparently, either the authorities had not been too impressed with Romer or were convinced that he was a reformed man. They would be extremely wrong. Romer joined a resistance group of German intellectuals named the Soul Circle, who were dedicated to opposing the Nazi Party at every possible opportunity. The group tracked Hitler's movements carefully, but Hitler's security had been dramatically increased due to all the pesky attempts on his life. Failing to find an opportunity to strike, the Soul Circle was eventually discovered and its members arrested in a Gestapo sting. The Soul Circle members were betrayed from within by a Gestapo spy, pretending to be a Swiss sympathizer, and most would meet their end via torture and execution. There was the one time Hitler was almost blown up by his own tanks. Even his own army wanted him dead. Many German generals were starting to warm up to the fact that Hitler was leading their nation to disaster by 1943. A group of them plotted to arrest Hitler upon his visit to a military detachment in Ukraine. One general's tanks would surround Hitler and his escorts completely, and if Hitler refused to surrender, they would simply kill everyone. Hitler's visit was cancelled at the last minute, and once more Das Führer escaped certain death. Multiple attempts all in the same day. March 13, 1943 would be the day Hitler would evade certain death 3 times, and he never even had a clue. First, a group of officers vowed to kill Hitler as he drove from the airport to a local army headquarters. Hitler, however, was accompanied by a heavy SS escort, and the plan was cancelled. Briefly delayed to lunch, a new plan was put into effect. During their lunch together, at a specified signal, several officers would rise and fire their pistols at Hitler. Hitler, however, was a no-show and the plan was cancelled. In a last-ditch effort to kill the luckiest SOB in history, a bomb was camouflaged as liquor bottles and planted on Hitler's airplane. The timer was set to blow as the plane was in flight and over Poland. However, the plane's hold iced over from the extreme temperatures and the fuse of the bomb failed. Our next killer's weapon of choice would be hugging and explosives. The death hug. Hitler's luck was so unbelievable that we wouldn't blame you for fact-checking us on the sheer number of times Hitler avoided death, purely by coincidence. Just a week after he was almost gunned down twice and then blown out of the sky, Hitler would evade death yet again. German officer Rudolf Christoph Freiherr von Gersdorf decided Hitler had to go at any cost. Hitler, along with several prominent Nazi and military figures, planned to visit Gersdorf at a Berlin armory where they could inspect captured Soviet weapons. Gersdorf then set about packing his coat pockets with time-delayed explosives, set for 10 minutes. Just as Hitler arrived, Gersdorf set off the timers, with a plan to hug Hitler right before the explosives went off, in order to ensure his death. It would be a suicide attack, but a necessary sacrifice for Germany. Incredibly, Hitler breezed through the entire exhibition in less than 10 minutes, which prompted Gersdorf to rush to a bathroom in order to disarm the explosives. The Allies save Hitler's life again. In late 1943, the Allies were pushing back hard against the Luftwaffe's domination of Europe's skies. This opened up opportunities for Allied planes to raid German infrastructure. One such raid would end up saving Hitler's life. The German army was preparing to put out a new winter uniform, and Major Axel von den Bussche was chosen to model it for Hitler in a private viewing. Bussche was tall, handsome, and blonde, and blue-eyed, basically the perfect Nazi in Hitler's view. but Bush actually planned to kill Hitler during the viewing by detonating a mine he would be carrying in his backpack. The planned viewing, however, was cancelled when an Allied air raid destroyed the rail car containing the new uniforms. Hitler, immune to explosives. By 1944, it was clear that Germany was losing the war. It was largely due to Hitler's ineptitude as a military leader. A group of senior German military officials concocted what would be known as Operation Valkyrie, as they attempted to kill Hitler and make peace with the Western Allies as soon as possible in order to avoid the complete destruction of Germany. The conspirators managed to plant a 2.2-pound bomb in a briefcase inside a meeting room where Hitler and his senior military advisors would discuss the ongoing war. Incredibly, Colonel Heinz Brandt is believed to have nudged the briefcase behind one of the legs of the table, effectively deflecting the bomb blast and sparing Hitler's life. Adolf Hitler was an idiot, and that's a good thing because it led him to make some really bad strategic decisions during World War II. If Hitler had been a little smarter, we might very well be living in a messed up Nazi-controlled world full of Hitler youth today. Luckily, that's not how history played out. As we progress through some of Hitler's worst decisions during World War II, you might be surprised to find that it was his ego, the name of an enemy, and his belief in the occult that partially cost him the war. Let's start at the beginning. When you're a genocidal maniac like Hitler, your choice of allies can end up being pretty slim. One of the main reasons that Hitler's Nazi Germany allied itself with Italy was because no one else was crazy enough to join him but Benito Mussolini. Most historians argue that Italy wasn't Hitler's first choice for an ally, or even his second or third choice, but when your entire platform is predicated on mass genocide and ruling the world in your own deranged way, not many people can be convinced to get on board. It was Mussolini's authoritarian rule and his dislike for Jewish people that made him the perfect ally for Hitler. However, allying himself with Benito was the first mistake Hitler would make that would eventually lead to him losing World War II. During wartime, you want a strong and independent ally who will have your back when things get tough and can bring something meaningful to the table. Mussolini's Italy was none of those things. Time and time again, Germany would have to bail out Italian forces as they continually became pinned down or surrounded by allies. This would cost Hitler greatly, as Germany would lose valuable resources and men whenever Italy failed its missions. Choosing the wrong ally was definitely one decision that cost Hitler in the long run, but it would not be the only one. The way he handled the North African campaign starting in 1940 ended up being a disaster to his cause. World War II started in Europe on September 1, 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Axis forces swept across the continent, securing strategic positions and decimating anyone who stood in their way. However, the same cannot be said about their campaign in North Africa, as it was brought to a grinding halt by an unexpected force. The main objective of the North African campaign was to secure the Suez Canal, which would allow the Nazi forces to have better access to oil coming from the Middle East. The Nazis had some of the best tanks, aircraft, and naval vessels in the world, which gave them the upper hand in many battles. However, without oil to fuel these vehicles, they were useless. Originally, Hitler left Italy in charge of securing North Africa, while he focused on decimating Western Europe. This was his first mistake. Italy had trouble defeating Allied forces in the region from the beginning, and Hitler had to send his men and tanks down to bail them out. The distance between Germany and North Africa meant this would take time, but it had to be done if the Axis powers were going to control the region. Eventually, Hitler decided to send General Erwin Rommel to the region to command the German tank forces in North Africa. His mission was to sweep across the continent from Morocco to the Middle East, and once there, he'd be in charge of maintaining control of the vast oil reserves in the region. This was a wise strategic move for Hitler, but the execution was performed poorly. After some initial success, things started to fall apart in North Africa. The main problem was that Rommel just didn't have the resources or tanks necessary to get the job done. Rommel made it as far as Tobruk in Libya before he ran into some issues. He was able to capture the seaport of Tobruk, but once the Nazi forces began their advance further east, they were stopped by British General Bernard Montgomery and El Alamein. For 12 days, Nazi and Italian forces tried to break the British line without success. Hitler was furious with the lack of progress in North Africa. After a second defeat at El Alamein, Rommel returned to Europe. He complained that he should have been left with the tank battalions in North Africa, where he was sure he could eventually defeat the Allied troops. However, whether it was Hitler's direct orders or his influence over the Nazis' military, Rommel was forced to stay in Germany while his forces in North Africa were defeated. The Allies had secretly landed more troops in Morocco and Algeria. They charged across the region and eventually trapped the retreating Axis forces. Altogether, around 250,000 German and Italian troops were captured. This would be a definitive turning point in the war to control North Africa and led to a huge disruption in the oil supply that fueled the Nazi war machine. As a side note, Rommel was later accused and convicted for playing a role in the 20th of July plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler. This led to the general being given two options: execution by the state or death by suicide. On October 14, 1944, Rommel bit down on a cyanide capsule and ended his life and career as a Nazi general. There's no clear evidence that Rommel actually played a role in the assassination attempt on Hitler's life. This may mean that rather than having a traitor killed, Hitler made the mistake of eliminating one of his best generals, as Rommel is traditionally seen as a brilliant commander in the field, and Hitler's mistakes would keep on coming. The United States played a major role in securing victory for Allied forces in Europe. However, one of the main reasons that the USA sent troops to Europe was because Hitler made the mistake of declaring war on the United States first. The US was sending supplies and resources to the Allies in Europe from very early on in the war. However, they had adopted somewhat of an isolationist policy and had no plans of directly intervening in Europe until December 11, 1941. That's when Hitler made another decision that would cost him the war. Early on in 1941, the United States had not sent or had plans to send troops to Europe. Then Pearl Harbor happened. Hitler had no idea that the Japanese were going to bomb Pearl Harbor, but he'd hoped from the beginning that Japan would pull the US into a war in the Pacific. This would cause them to focus their attention on the other side of the world, likely reducing the amount of supplies they were sending to Britain. Instead of letting those events play out, Hitler did something really dumb. He started attacking American supply ships in the Atlantic and immediately declared war on the US. Hitler was delusional, and he thought even if he destroyed American convoys and declared war on the country, the US would still be too preoccupied with Japan to retaliate. However, nothing could have been further from the truth. The United States' economy was incredibly strong and had already begun ramping up wartime production. They had the men, the resources, and now the motive to fight a war on two fronts. At the time, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was still on the fence about whether troops should be sent to Europe or if the United States should solely focus on Japan. But Hitler's decision to declare war on the US prematurely made the decision easy for him. America would go to war with Nazi Germany and kick their ass, and Hitler only had himself to blame. Just to put it in perspective on how big of a mistake this was, every year of the war, the United States constructed twice as many planes and war vehicles as Nazi Germany did. The United States also had immense resources and a huge labor pool to pull from. With everyone now united under the declaration of war against the United States by Adolf Hitler, the whole country put everything they had into the war effort to defeat Nazi Germany. In the summer of 1941, Hitler would make a decision that would cost him enormous amounts of men, resources, and pretty much the war itself. On June 22nd, the Nazis launched Operation Barbarossa. At the beginning of the war, Hitler was smart enough to have Soviet Russia sign a non-aggression pact, which ensured that they wouldn't attack Germany from the east. This allowed him to focus his attention on Western Europe and defeating Great Britain. However, Hitler was not smart enough to not break his own pact. He launched an invasion into Russia, which meant Germany now had to fight countries to its east and west, defeating the purpose of preventing a two-front war. This decision was a huge mistake and one of the critical factors that cost him the war. At first, Nazi Germany seemed to have the upper hand. Stalin was delusional and thought that there was no way Hitler would break his promise and invade Russia. But this was Adolf Hitler we're talking about, and he obviously couldn't be trusted. The Germans amassed forces along the Russian border. In fact, they weren't even very discreet about it. Hitler had always planned to invade the Soviet Union. He just wanted to wait until all of Europe was under his control first. However, with resources running low and the need for a new source of labor, Hitler launched his invasion early. He fully committed to this decision, even though many of his military advisors warned that conquering the Soviet Union and fighting a two-front war would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. He ignored them and launched the offensive into Russia anyway. At the beginning of the invasion, the Nazis were winning almost every battle. Hitler patted himself on the back for a job well done and scoffed at anyone who was still wary of sending troops into Russian territory. History has shown that trying to take over Russia never works out well for the invading force. Nazi morale was high as they marched further and further into the Soviet Union. The dirt roads were passable in the summer months, and the Nazi uniforms provided enough warmth to stay relatively comfortable even at night. Hitler was so convinced that the war in Russia would be over quickly that he held off on sending more supplies and winter gear to the troops who were advancing further into the Soviet Union. But as the winter months approached, the weather began to change. The tide of the
war in Russia was about to shift. Operation Barbarossa was a massive offensive with 3 different attack forces spread across approximately 1,800 miles of land. As all 3 parts of the German army started to reach their objectives, they were slowed down by terrible weather, lack of food, and depletion of resources. The Russian people destroyed their own villages, farms, and factories as they retreated further into the Soviet Union to get away from the Nazi invasion. Hitler's original plan had been to resupply his troops using Russian resources as they made their way across the country. It was too long a distance to constantly be resupplying his forces from Germany. Plus, the whole point of invading the Soviet Union was to secure more resources. However, the Russian people left very little of use behind due to their scorched earth policy. When the northern offensive reached Leningrad, they thought that it would fall quickly as the rest of Russia did, but this was not the case. The Germans couldn't manage to secure Leningrad from the Russians, and resources were running dangerously low. On top of that, the Nazi forces in the south also ran into trouble. They were stopped dead in their tracks by entrenched Russian soldiers and couldn't advance any further. Hitler was furious. He ordered the middle offensive to send troops to the north and south, which weakened the middle force while not improving the situation in the other regions by much. The slowing down of the German advance allowed the Soviets to regroup. Over 1 million troops and 1,000 tanks were sent to Moscow to protect the capital. The Nazis were now stopped on all fronts. They couldn't manage to take Leningrad in the north, and due to their Soviet reinforcements in the middle of the country and the changing of the weather, capturing Moscow was a lost cause as well. It was becoming more and more clear that Hitler's decision to invade Russia was a huge mistake. The Germans had not brought enough winter supplies due to Hitler's overconfidence. He also gravely underestimated the resilience of the Russian people and how many of them would join in the cause to stop Germany from taking their land. Stalin had a huge population to fuel his war machine, and the resources contained within the Soviet Union's borders allowed them to quickly resupply, while the Germans struggled to get simple things such as food and warm clothes to their troops. While the invasion of Soviet Russia was failing, Hitler seemed to lose his mind. He started blaming everyone else for his bad decisions. This led to another huge mistake. Rather than listening to his generals and advisors who knew more about war than he did, Hitler decided to make himself commander-in-chief of the Nazi army. He couldn't believe that his troops hadn't yet secured Russia. They would have to double their efforts, and anyone who ever mentioned the word retreat would be executed. Everyone who had been serving on the front lines of the war knew that trying to subdue Russia and take its capital would be a lost cause. But Hitler would hear none of it. He wanted Moscow to fall, and he wanted it bad. So he put himself in charge of the military to make sure that no one did anything rash like withdraw and come up with a better plan. Hitler was going to take Russia or lose the war trying, which is exactly what he did. He had to put himself in an unwinnable position, fighting 2 fronts while also bringing the United States into the fray, and he was quickly running out of resources. Things were about to go from bad to worse, and it all had to do with Hitler's next few decisions. Hitler often let his feelings get in the way of making good wartime decisions, and perhaps there's no better example than the Battle of Stalingrad, which began in August of 1942 as part of the Nazis' southern advance into Russia. The city was a manufacturing hub for the Soviets, which meant it had great strategic importance. The Nazis did not necessarily need to secure the entire city in order to disrupt the Russian supply chain. Instead, all they really needed was to blockade Stalingrad to make sure nothing got in or out. However, Hitler had something else in mind. For Hitler, there was almost nothing more important than taking the city of Stalingrad. Not because of its importance, but because it was named after Joseph Stalin, the then leader of the Soviet Union. Hitler believed that it'd be a huge blow to Russian morale and a huge boost to his own ego if the Nazis took the city bearing the leader's name. To be fair, Stalingrad would have provided the Nazis with desperately needed fuel and supplies, but Hitler couldn't help but let his feelings get involved in this wartime decision. For 3 months, the Nazis tried to take the city. They were unsuccessful due to Hitler's obsession with conquering Russia on all fronts, rather than focusing his troops on one location. The Nazis even had taken much of the oil fields and resource-rich areas of Ukraine and Crimea. But rather than holding the line and coming up with a better plan, Hitler ordered his troops forward to the meat grinder of Stalingrad. This was a huge mistake because it left their rear flank vulnerable to counterattack. Whether Hitler realized this and just didn't care or he was too focused on taking Stalingrad to notice is up for debate. Regardless, Soviet generals did notice and they sent a force to attack the rear guard of the Nazi army. The Soviets managed to break through the Nazi defenses and surround them. This allowed the Soviets to cut off desperately needed supplies by capturing military bases and airfields as they tightened their hold in the region. Hitler ordered General Friedrich Paulus, who was in charge of the Nazi forces in southern Russia, to continue fighting or be court-martialed and let someone else take over. Paulus decided to take the third option and save the lives of many of his men as possible by surrendering to the Soviets instead. Due to Hitler's crazed attempt to take Stalingrad, which was done mostly because of the name, the Nazis lost hundreds of thousands of men in southern Russia. After Stalingrad, there was no hope of Hitler turning the war around. The Nazi forces were now retreating back toward Germany, the Soviets capturing anything they left behind and wiped out Nazi forces that got in their way. By the beginning of 1943, not only had Hitler lost millions of troops and vehicles, but he was losing the confidence of his people. The low morale of civilians and military personnel alike would cause the Nazi war machine to be less effective. Early footage of Nazi rallies show huge crowds of enthralled people hanging on Hitler's every word. However, after the Eastern Front began to collapse and the threat of a Soviet invasion loomed on the horizon, the German people started to panic and lose faith in their fearless leader. The final nail in the coffin was the failed attempt to invade the Soviet Union and secure Moscow and Stalingrad. This wiped out any remaining morale left in the German people. To make matters worse, Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt had just met in Casablanca and decided it was time to commence bombing runs on German soil. This led to death and destruction at home, which the German people had not experienced up to this point. It was a real eye-opener that their Führer might not be able to deliver on all the promises he made, and the war might be in fact a total loss. At the end of the summer in 1943, incendiary bombs were dropped on Hamburg. The destruction and fire they caused destroyed practically the entire city and killed around 40,000 people. After the bombing run, approximately 900,000 Germans were left homeless. The war had now become very real for the average German citizen. It also became clear that many in the military were losing faith in the Führer. Over 20,000 Nazi troops were court-martialed and executed for various reasons, most of which stemmed from their lack of confidence in Adolf Hitler. Without the trust and enthusiasm of his people and military personnel, there was no way that Hitler could win the war. The only thing worse for Hitler than having the Russians closing in from the east, Italy falling apart in the south, and military supplies running low on all fronts would be if the British and Americans somehow managed to land in France and secure a foothold on mainland Europe. On June 6, 1944, Hitler's worst fear came to be. On top of being crazy, egotistical, and power-hungry monster, Hitler was also gullible. He allowed the Allies to trick him and his generals into deploying troops at the wrong locations along the Atlantic Wall as D-Day was carried out. The Allies knew they'd be landing at Normandy, but they definitely didn't want Hitler to know that, so they used false radio broadcasts, dummy aircraft, and misinformation to trick Hitler into moving his forces away from the actual landing zones. The plan worked. And when Allied forces stormed the beaches, they met much less resistance than they would have otherwise. There's no doubt that the D-Day invasion was a gruesome and terrible moment in World War II history that cost the lives of thousands of Allied soldiers, but it ended up being successful because of the Allies' ability to trick Hitler. With Allied troops now on mainland Europe, there was nowhere to run. Nazi forces were recalled back to the fatherland as an invasion of Germany was now imminent. All of the key events mentioned thus far were not the only reasons Hitler lost the war. There were some factors that Hitler handled poorly throughout the entire conflict that led to his demise. These can't be pinpointed to a specific event or battle, but instead show how a bloodthirsty tyrant can let his vision for world domination get in his own way. Perhaps the biggest mistake that Hitler made was overextending his forces. This was such a problem because throughout the war, maintaining supply lines was a huge issue for the Nazis. They constantly found themselves in need of more resources, the most important of which were fuel and food to supply their vehicles and troops. In the initial months of the war, Axis powers secured vast amounts of land across Europe and North Africa. However, this meant that supplies and resources needed to travel incredibly long distances to reach troops. Vehicles and ammunition that were made in Germany could take weeks or months to reach the front lines. Might sound crazy, but Nazi Germany even had to rely pretty heavily on horses to transport supplies to some regions due to a lack of vehicles and landscape. This meant Hitler's war machine moved quickly at first, but then came to a grinding halt, as supplies took forever to get where they needed to go. If he was somehow able to quickly move the resources and his troops needed throughout the entire war, it's likely Hitler could have won. The German supply line also forced Hitler into one of the biggest mistakes in World War II. Nazi forces needed oil, and they needed a lot of it. This was the main reason why Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. If he had been able to secure oil, steel, and food from any other source, he could have avoided starting a war with Russia, which would have meant Germany wouldn't have needed to fight a war on two fronts. Therefore, it was the lack of resources and supply line issues that were the overarching cause that led to Adolf Hitler losing World War II. Perhaps the most surprising factor that led to Hitler's defeat wasn't anything to do with the military or supply chain at all. Instead, perhaps his obsession with magic and the occult was a driving factor behind some of his worst decisions. The Nazis' fascination with the occult wasn't just made up to create Indiana Jones movies. Instead, mysticism played a pretty important role in Hitler's decision-making policies. For example, the Nazis were constantly on the search for the Holy Grail, as the promise of everlasting life Adolf was a huge draw for Hitler and his entourage of occultists. Hitler and the rest of the Nazi leadership were not Christians, but they still believed that certain relics were imbued with mystical powers. But the search for mystical relics was only one aspect of Hitler's use of the occult. He actually used pretty strange practices to help make some wartime decisions as well. Some accounts report that Hitler and Nazi military leaders frequently used a pendulum and dowsing rod to determine the location of Allied warships on maps of the ocean. These devices have no actual magical powers or any measurable effect on determining the location of an object, including naval vessels, so any decisions made using these techniques would be as good as if Hitler had just closed his eyes and randomly pointed to an area on the map with his finger to determine where the Allied forces were. Other important military decisions were made under the advisement of astrologers, magicians, and tarot card readers. Again, there's no scientific basis that any of these practices can have a positive effect on wartime decisions. Belief in the occult and mysticism definitely played less of a role in Hitler losing World War II than the other factors discussed in this video, but you can't help but wonder how many of his bad decisions were actually the result of following the advice of psychics or in pursuit of some magical artifact.
It's summer 1943, and the Allied forces have moved to secure the Mediterranean from the Axis powers once and for all. This means one thing: neutralizing Italy, a staunch German ally led by the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, sweeping away the Italian navy, which performed atrociously against Allied forces. Allied soldiers at last began to make landfall on Sicily. From captured airfields, American and British bombers could now reach Rome, and an intense bombing campaign begins against Italy's capital. The intent is not so much to damage Italian industry and its warfighting ability, but rather to capitalize on the low morale of Italian troops and citizens and force them to overthrow Mussolini, thus suing for peace with the Allies. Throughout the war, aside from a few notable exceptions in Africa, Italian forces performed extremely poorly, and soon Hitler was sending experienced officers to supervise his allies' military. The Germans saw it as a babysitting assignment, and the Italians were simply sick of war. They'd been lied to after all. Mussolini had promised to turn the Mediterranean into a giant Italian lake, and now the Allies were on Italian territory. The time was ripe for revolution, and shortly after the beginning of the bombing campaign, the Italian government ousted Mussolini, imprisoning him on a mountaintop ski resort, a secure prison for one of the world's most dangerous men. This was a disaster for Hitler, but he had one ace up his sleeve: a single man, Otto Skorzeny, possibly the most dangerous man of World War II. Skorzeny had made a name for himself as a firebrand Nazi and devout fascist, quickly climbing the ranks of the German military. Skorzeny's first ambition had been to become a pilot, and shortly after the invasion of Poland he had volunteered for the Luftwaffe, but was denied for being too tall. At 6 foot 4 inches, Otto was a formidable man indeed, and when his imposing bulk prevented him from becoming a pilot, he joined Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard regiment instead. As Hitler launched his invasion of the Soviet Union, Skorzeny was back on the front lines, fighting with elite SS units. As the Nazis pushed closer to Moscow, Skorzeny received orders from Hitler himself. He was to capture several key Communist Party buildings and the NKVD headquarters. This would have afforded the German military with huge amounts of valuable intelligence and bid a devastating blow to Soviet fighting morale. But Skorzeny's greatest prize was the sluice gates to the Moscow Canal. Hitler had plans to open the sluice gates wide and let all of Moscow flood, turning the Soviet capital into a lake. Fortunately for the Soviets, the German advance began to falter and then halt. Far too valuable to be lost on the Eastern Front, Otto Skorzeny was ordered back to Germany after being hit in the back of the head by shrapnel. Healing from his injuries, Skorzeny had nothing but time on his hands, time that he used to contemplate his previous orders to capture important communist buildings, the Soviet secret police headquarters, and the Moscow Canal sluice gates. Skorzeny felt that the German military lacked units specialized in such forms of unconventional warfare, and began to develop theories on waging unconventional warfare deep behind enemy lines. He studied historical partisan movements and spoke with experienced infantry and paratrooper commanders. In a time before special forces, Otto Skorzeny was developing the first modern plan for a special operations task force. Skorzeny's task force would operate deep behind enemy lines and use subterfuge, espionage, and intelligence rather than brute force to achieve its objectives. By Skorzeny's accounting, a small team of specialized commandos could easily accomplish more than an entire company of infantry could. He was only too right, as British commandos were already training and preparing for deployment behind enemy lines on mainland Europe. The powers that be were slow to listen to Skorzeny, however, at least until British commandos began raiding behind enemy lines in Europe to devastating success. To even his staunchest critics, Skorzeny was quickly proved right.
A small team of elite soldiers could in fact accomplish far more than entire companies of infantry could. Skorzény's name was quickly put forward to command Nazi Germany's first true special operations training schools, and soon he was made commander of the Waffen-Sonderverband ZBV Friedenthal Special Forces Unit. Germany may not have been short on syllables, but they were short on allies, and one of Skorzény's unit's first missions was to parachute behind enemy lines in Iran and contact local tribes. It was hoped that tribal members in Iran could be incited to attack Allied supply lines to the Soviet Union, which despite its massive manpower was almost completely reliant on American supplies for its war effort. Luckily for the Soviets, the effort was deemed unsuccessful when most of the tribes contacted refused to take part in raids. Skorzény's next efforts, however, would be much more fruitful for Nazi Germany. After Mussolini's ousting from power by the Italian Grand Council of Fascism, Hitler knew that the Italian king would declare an armistice with the Allies. This would be a major setback for the German war effort, as Italy had forced considerable resources to be dedicated to the Mediterranean by the Allies. It also threatened his links to oil supply routes in the Middle East, and would give Allied aircraft access to Germany's southern flank if Italy allowed Allied warplanes to be stationed on its territory. Thankfully, the mighty Alps made an overland invasion of Germany from Italy all but impossible, but still Mussolini had to be restored to power, and there was only one man who could get the job done. Locating Mussolini was not easy, as the Italians feared that the Germans would doubtlessly launch a rescue. Hesitant to simply hand him over to the Allies as no armistice had been declared yet, the Italian government had hoped to use Mussolini as a bargaining chip as it sued for peace. To keep the German rescue effort at bay, the Italians moved Mussolini from location to location, making him difficult to track. For weeks, Skorzeny and some of his most trusted men worked the streets of major Italian cities, gathering intelligence and intercepting radio messages. Skorzeny made free use of counterfeit British pounds, created in yet another unconventional Nazi war plan to defeat the Allies, to bribe Italian officials, and recruit double agents and informants. At last, Mussolini was located, and a rescue plan could be put into effect. But rescuing Mussolini would be one of the riskiest operations of World War II. Fully aware of a plot to rescue their fascist dictator, the Italians had taken great precautions with the imprisonment of Mussolini. They moved the dictator to a mountaintop ski resort high in the Apennine Mountains, which could only be accessed by a cable car. The cable car station was itself guarded by Italian infantry, and at the mountaintop resort, Mussolini was guarded by 200 elite Carabinieri guards. The resort was in effect a fortress, with only the cable cars leading up to the top of the mountain. Any troops attempting to use the cars would be slaughtered long before they got a chance to disembark. Rescue would be impossible. But the Italians never counted on the borderline insane daring of Otto Skorzeny. Realizing that the only possible way to get to Mussolini would be to avoid the rail cars altogether, Skorzeny consulted with some of the best Luftwaffe pilots, and he had one question for them. Could a glider be landed on the grounds of the ski resort despite the treacherous mountain air currents? Most agreed that technically, yes, it should be possible, but the risk was insane. Unpowered gliders would be completely at the mercy of tumultuous mountain wind currents, and landing room on top of the mountain was already extremely limited. Even if gliders made it safely, it would be a miracle if they stopped in time before tumbling off the edge of the mountain. On the 12th of September 1943, the weather was at last suitable for the attempted rescue, and Otto Skorzeny and his men loaded up onto 10 gliders. Each glider carried a single pilot and 9 soldiers, bringing a total of 90 elite SS troopers to face off against 200 heavily armed Italian Carabinieri. But Skorzeny had a trump card to play in this gambit. Flying alongside him was General Fernando Soletti, head of the Polizia dell'Africa Italiana, and a respected officer. Skorzeny gambled that if caught unawares in a surprise attack and with the presence of a respected Italian officer, the Carabinieri would stand down. He'd soon find out. As the gliders lifted into the air, 2 companies of German paratroopers launched an attack on the forces holding the cable car station at the base of the mountain. The fighting was fierce, but the Italians were quickly overwhelmed by the far more experienced and capable German troops. Still, not a single German would live to reach the top of the mountain unless Skorzeny was successful, and so the troops held their position to prevent Mussolini being moved via the cable cars. The mountain currents made flying treacherous, more so for the unpowered gliders. The bombers towing the first 3 gliders decided that they needed to gain more altitude before releasing the gliders, and thus began long, slow looping turns to gain altitude. This would threaten the delicate timeline that the operation needed for success, however, and Skorzeny ordered the rest of the planes to continue, regardless of the risk to the gliders. If Skorzeny could not take and evacuate Mussolini quickly, then more Italian forces would soon be on their way. Released from their two hooks, the gliders shuddered in the tumultuous winds of the Italian mountains. The pilots, among some of the best in Nazi Germany, fought the controls to keep the gliders stable and on course. Incredibly, one by one, the German gliders made the almost impossible landing on the tiny tabletop shelf of land at the top of the mountain. Although one of the last to arrive crashed, severely injuring many of its occupants. Leaping from the gliders, though, the bulk of Scorzeni's force was soon running toward the hotel. Scorzeni had given his men a strict order. Not a single one of them was to open fire unless Scorzeni opened fire first. If Scorzeni was injured or died, then one of his officers would be the first to open fire. It was critical that the assault force capture Mussolini without having to fight the 200-strong Italian defenders. With General Fernando Soletti ordering the guards to stand down, the Italians laid down their arms and allowed Mussolini to be taken. In less than an hour, one of the riskiest operations of World War II had succeeded without a single shot being fired. Scorzeni would be an overnight hero to Nazi Germany and earn his place in the Special Forces Hall of Fame if he survived the final phase of the plan to rescue Mussolini, the escape. German forces would be unable to provide security for Mussolini if they tried to bring him down the mountain and move him by land. Therefore, a small plane was ordered to make the incredible risky landing atop the mountain. This would be Mussolini's ticket off the mountain. But there was a problem. The small plane only had enough power and room for its pilot and one other passenger, and Scorzeni refused to leave Mussolini out of his sight. The pilot argued with Scorzeni, telling him that there was little chance that the plane could hit the required speed for liftoff if it were carrying the weight of the three men. Scorzeni refused to budge. Mussolini was his personal responsibility, and he would be the one to see him brought before the Führer himself. Then Scorzeni pointed out the obvious. If the airplane required velocity to generate lift and the takeoff area was too short, then it would simply have to gain speed by falling off the side of the mountain. Scorzeni climbed aboard the tiny plane alongside Mussolini and, under the threat of being shot, ordered the pilot to take off. The tiny plane sputtered to life and began to roll toward the edge of the mountain, slowly picking up speed. As the precipice loomed before them, the pilot's worst fears were realized. The plane could not take off overburdened as it was. The wheels soon left the ground as the plane pitched over the mountainside. By some miracle, however, the plane shuddered its way back to horizontal after a brief dive. Against all odds, Scorzeni had pulled off one of the most daring rescue operations in history. Otto Scorzeni would go on to achieve great success during the waning days of World War II, cementing his place as one of Nazi Germany's most dangerous soldiers. The man became an international special forces legend, and most of his training and operational methods would go on to influence or be outright adopted by special forces programs around the world. Perhaps most surprising of all, however, would be Scorzeni's eventual role as a Mossad agent working for the Israeli secret organization and helping bring Nazi war criminals to justice.
It's September 18, 1931. Adolf Hitler has not quite turned into the beast he'll become known as, but the man sure does have a temper. He's at his Munich apartment, screaming and shouting, spit flying out of his mouth. The object of his fury is his half-niece, Gaily Raubal. Some people say this girl would be the only love of his life, but on this day, the two are engaged in a tempestuous clash. Is it because he is the father she never really had, or he just loves her dearly, so he doesn't want her to leave? Or is she pregnant with his child, an embarrassment to Adolf and the Nazi party? Is he just out of his mind on a cocktail of hard drugs? Or is she the one who's deranged? This is still a mystery, but what isn't a mystery is that soon after this argument occurred, Gaily was found with a bullet in her dead body, with her uncle Adolf's smoking gun at her side. That's right, and many people thought that Hitler had fired that gun. The story became one of the biggest scandals in Germany during the period. There's just so much people don't know about Mr. Adolf Hitler. That's why today we're going to take a look at his life and try to figure out why he was the way he was. This show is not so much about Hitler as we know him, the man who waged war on the world, but the man himself. That's why we'll call him Adolf today. We'll come back to the question of if he murdered his niece a bit later, but first let's have a look at that little bundle of joy that was Adolf as a kid. He was born on April 20th, 1889, which made him a Taurus. Okay, so we know most of you don't believe in that kind of thing, but there's no doubt that Adolf was the proverbial bull in a china shop. He smashed up half of Europe. He was born in what is present-day Austria to his father Aloy and his mother Clara. You'll hear many unusual things today, including that Clara was Aloy's third wife and that also his second cousin. She became part of his household at the age of 16, but first as a maid. At that time, Aloy was still married to his second wife. Clara left the household but came back when Aloy's second wife died. She helped Aloy bring up the children and then got pregnant with him. As this was sketchy business back then, they had to go to the church and ask for permission to marry. What's also strange is that she still called him uncle when she was intimate with him.
As you'll see later in the show in relation to Adolf, we can invoke the expression "the apple didn't fall far from the tree." The two were married in January 1885. Adolf was their fourth child. Clara absolutely loved him. He was a mama's boy, no doubt, which shaped the man he would become. There's also been some speculation that Adolf was beaten by his father and shielded by his mother, but historians aren't too sure of just how physical Aloy got with Adolf. Still, it's said that Aloy was domineering, aggressive, and sometimes cruel. The family at least wasn't too badly off since Aloy earned decent money as a customs official. One of the reasons that Clara liked Adolf so much was the fact that she already had lost two of her kids, Gustav and Ida, to diphtheria. Out of 6 children she had with Aloy, only 2 survived childhood, Adolf and Paula. Not surprisingly, Paula changed her name after the Second World War. It is safe to say that Adolf feared his father and adored his mother. When his father died in 1903, Adolf was 13, and he didn't seem overly troubled. Now he had his mother all to himself. Yes, this is all very Freudian. Just wait until you hear about his sex life when he becomes an adult. Freud would have had a field day. Adolf was always a sickly child, so soon after his father's death, Clara pulled him out of school and told him he could concentrate on his newfound love, art. He loved sketching, playing piano, and was keen on other creative pursuits. This is why she was supportive when he told her he wanted to go to Vienna and try to become a paid artist. Off he went, and oh boy, did he struggle to make it. At times, he barely had enough money to feed himself. Vienna was a nightmare. In 1906, Clara discovered a lump in her breast, and so she went to the family doctor. It wasn't good news. She had breast cancer. But it seemed the doctor didn't tell her at first. It was Adolf that eventually told her what was wrong. This devastated him. Clara underwent a mastectomy soon after, but the cancer metastasized. The Hitlers were informed that Clara was not long for this world. Adolf returned from Vienna and became her caretaker. He watched her suffer in pain as she was treated with an experimental type of chemotherapy. This was almost impossible for him to watch. Her throat became seriously swollen, making it difficult for her to eat or speak. This period in Adolf's life would seep into the very marrow of his bones. Clara died on December 21, 1907. Adolf was more than sad. He was stricken with grief to the point of delirium. The family doctor said some years later, "In all my career, I have never seen anyone so prostrate with grief as Adolf Hitler." This doctor was actually Jewish, so when Adolf was killing Jewish people in the millions, he allowed the doctor to emigrate from Austria to the USA. This was his way of saying thanks for trying. We should say it's not certain if it was Adolf that helped the doctor get away, but that is the theory. During the war, when the doctor was in the US, he was contacted by the Office of Strategic Services, an intelligence agency that was the precursor to the CIA. They wanted to know what Adolf Hitler was like as a child. What made the monster? The doctor said, "While Hitler was not a mother's boy in the usual sense, I never witnessed a closer attachment. Their love had been mutual. Clara Hitler adored her son. She allowed him his own way whenever possible. For example, she admired his watercolor paintings and drawings and supported his artistic ambitions in opposition to his father, at what cost to herself, one may guess." Even though Adolf had been loved by his mother, you can't argue with the fact that he had a pretty grim childhood. He grew up with a tyrannical father in a family that had suffered the loss of 4 children. And just when Adolf was trying to enjoy his adulthood, he had no parents at all. As he grew older, he always carried a picture of his mother around in his pocket. In his house, he had pictures of her on the wall. When he became the leader of the Nazi Party and the Führer of Germany, he designated her birthday of August 12 as a day of honor for the German mother. We can look to his sister Paula to know more about Adolf. She wrote a diary when she was a child, and it's quite interesting. In it, she talked about how her brother bullied her throughout her youth. In one entry she wrote, "Once again I felt my brother's hand land on my face." It seems she never joined the Nazi Party or outwardly showed any support for her older brother's ambitions, although in 2005 a historian discovered that at one point during the war Paula was in a relationship with a Third Reich officer named Erwin Jekelius. The psychiatrist and neurologist was involved with the terrible Nazi euthanasia programs. He ended up a prisoner of the Soviet Union and later died from bladder cancer in a Soviet labor camp in 1952. Paula wanted to marry him, but Adolf wouldn't give his permission. You'd think she would have hated Adolf for that, but it seems despite the bullying, she actually admired him. When the US Army interviewed her in 1945, she outright didn't believe that her brother would order the killing of millions of Jews. We can glean more about Adolf's life from the transcript of the interview. Paula said, "My father, who was of great harshness in the education of his children, and who only spoiled me as the family's pet, was the absolute type of old Austrian official, conservative, and loyal to his emperor to the skin. My mother, however, was a very soft and tender person. When her mother was sick with cancer, she said Adolf did nothing but care for her and her mother. She said, assisting me, my brother Adolf spoiled my mother during this time of her life with overflowing tenderness. He was indefatigable with his care for her, wanting to comply with any desire she could possibly have, and all to demonstrate his great love for her. She said Adolf showed little interest in most of his subjects in school and only ever seemed interested in artistic endeavors. She told the interviewer, at school he was nothing less than a showboy. He often came home with bad school reports and admonitions. One thing she was adamant about was that her dear brother could not have done all the wicked things he'd been accused of. I do not believe that my brother ordered the crime committed to innumerable human beings in the concentration camps, or that he even knew of these crimes," she said. Although she did add, it may be possible, however, that the hard years during his youth in Vienna caused his anti-Jewish attitude. He was starving severely in Vienna, and he believed that his failure in painting was only due to the fact that trade in works of art was in Jewish hands. This is important. Adolf, while not a terrible artist, was a failure. His dreams dissolved before his eyes. His stomach ached while others prospered, and he was sure he was just as good as them. As an artist, he was very average, with one critic rightly saying many years later, if you walk down the Seine and see 100 artists, 80 will be better than this. Adolf may have only been harsh with his sister because in some ways he thought it was his responsibility to act that way. He always made sure she had money at least. Maybe Adolf wasn't always a monster, but monstrous ideas formed somewhere in that warped head of his. What we consider evil doesn't always look monstrous. Evil often wears a suit and tie and has impeccable manners. This is why the political theorist Hannah Arendt talked about the banality of evil. You can be a loving husband and father and still go to work where you usher hordes of innocent people into a gas chamber. Lest we forget normal people can do terrible things. We must never forget that about Adolf Hitler. He wasn't always a fiend. We can see this in his love for animals, especially where his beloved dog was concerned. If you're wondering how Adolf could be so fond of animals and yet send humans toward torture and death, you can turn to a book that states, for leading Nazis, animal protection and crimes against humanity were not a contradiction in terms. On the contrary, they even felt that they were part of a moral elite. It's a difficult proposition to ask people to accept that a man whose ideology classed certain people as subhuman could have a nice side. He caused pain and anguish on a level that put Nero and Genghis Khan to shame. But he wasn't always monstrous, his ideology was. An American journalist once asked how people can order bombs to be dropped on totally innocent civilians in modern conflicts and then go to church and have family barbecues with the kids around. The simple fact is that they really think they are morally on the right side of history. Isn't that always the case when humans are destroyed in mass? Destroyers of worlds take the moral high ground. They say they're doing the killing for the greater good when so often it simply boils down to power and economic interests. But with Adolf, as you'll see, there were also mental issues, severe mental issues, at a time when many Germans were looking for a leader to bail them out from years of poverty and hardships. But let's not get ahead of ourselves here. We still have the younger Adolf to think about, the man that came before those death camps and blitzkriegs. Adolf Hitler fought in the First World War, and for his bravery he received the Iron Cross. He seemed to have some romantic notion about war, despite just how bloody awful that war was. He once said war was the greatest of all experiences. But man, was he bitter when Germany lost. Adolf, like many others in Germany, blamed the capitulation on Jews and Marxists. He was sure that what he considered real Germans wouldn't have given up so easily, although they hardly gave up easily. His thinking became quite clear in 1919. He wrote what is now referred to as the Gromlich Letter. This is an important piece of history for anyone who studies the Holocaust, since it's the first time we see Adolf Hitler's anti-Semitism on record. He wrote in the letter that the government's aim must unshakably be the removal of the Jews altogether. We won't talk too much about this rise to power since this show is more about Adolf Hitler, the man, but we will say that he got involved with politics and never turned back. He wrote about that later, saying, "I finally came to the conviction that I had to take this step. It was the most decisive resolve of my life. From here, there was and could be no turning back." Soon he was filling beer houses and heads with the hatred he preached, and people roared with delight when he spoke. He chose populist themes. He chose the use of scapegoats. Everyone's misery was the fault of these people or those people. One person who watched those early speeches later said, "We erupted into a frenzy of nationalistic pride that bordered on hysteria. For minutes on end, we shouted at the top of our lungs, with tears streaming down our faces, 'Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil.' From that moment on, I belonged to Adolf Hitler body and soul." Sieg Heil means hail to victory, if you didn't know. Adolf's extreme views of a superior Aryan race became the fundamental foundation of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, aka the Nazi Party. He was the one who actually designed the flag of the party, the swastika, an ancient Sanskrit symbol that means something like well-being and prosperity. Hitler rotated the symbol and made some changes to creating a hooked cross, or Hakenkreuz, now a symbol that reminds us of hate and genocide. He once said why he chose the ancient Sanskrit symbol, writing, "In red we see the social ideal of the movement, in white the nationalistic idea, in the swastika the mission of the struggle for the victory of the Aryan man, and by the same token the victory of the idea of creative work, which as such always has been and always will be anti-Semitic." Again, we have to skip a bit of history. The Nazis attempted a coup and failed, which is why Adolf ended up in prison. This is when he dictated his book Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, in English. This contained much of his hateful ideology. He compares certain kinds of people to germs and parasites. It's totalitarianism 101. Always dehumanize your enemy. That way they'll be easier to kill. He got out of prison and later he took full advantage of the Great Depression. Many Germans were near starving. People were so desperate for food they were eating horses that died in the streets. Well, they did that at least on one occasion. Folks were fed up, and when the public is down, you can be sure the populists get rolling. Extremism is always at its most influential when the populace is desperate. Adolf's rise to power was almost certain. In spite of how many enemies he had in Germany, he would soon put an end to many of them. As the Social Democrats and the Communists were arguing with each other, Adolf Hitler was attracting larger and larger crowds when he spoke at events. This ascension was watched by Adolf's nephew. This guy can give us some more insights into Adolf the man. Not many people know that Adolf had a nephew born in the UK. He was the son of Adolf's half-brother Alois Hitler Jr. and was named William Hitler. Ironically, William grew up in Liverpool on 102 Upper Stanhope Street, a house that was destroyed in the Liverpool Blitz during the war. As William grew into adulthood, he saw his uncle Adolf rise to power in Germany. He went to Germany to visit a few times and ended up living there. On the back of Adolf becoming chancellor when William was just 22, he landed a few jobs, one at an automotive factory. We tend not to think about Adolf in terms of a man who had squabbles with his family. But as we said, monsters are always all too human, as Hitler's favorite philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche might have said. According to William, his uncle was often a right royal pain in the backside, once saying, "I cannot even go on an outing without risking a summons to Hitler." Adolf, as you probably already figured out, was very controlling. This might be the understatement of the century, given he wanted to control half the world. But he was like that with his own family. He was petty too, according to William, who, it must be said, never really bought into all that Nazi ideology his uncle was screaming about to desperate German citizens. Adolf didn't like that his nephew was going back and forth between England and Germany, and no doubt spilling all the family secrets. Like any dictator to be, Adolf was trying to build a kind of mythology around himself. He was trying to tell people he was leading the Aryan race to better pastures, and he didn't want anyone to know his weaknesses. So Adolf got very upset when William started talking about his uncle's dandruff problem and his proclivity to lose his temper over trifling matters. Then, in 1939, he wrote an article for Look magazine entitled, "Why I Hate My Uncle." Talk about demythologizing the Fuhrer. The article dispelled any notion of the Fuhrer's almost godlike status. William wrote, "We had cakes and whipped cream, Hitler's favorite dessert. I was struck by his intensity, his feminine gestures. There was dandruff on his coat." Perhaps the whole purpose of this article was just making a quick buck. But for a while, he'd been blackmailing his uncle, telling him, "Get me a better job or I'll go to the press and I'll let all the cats out of the bags." It must have taken some balls, considering that he was blackmailing a man who ordered the deaths of millions of people. William didn't risk going back to Germany after that, and he'd even go on to fight against the Nazis for the Americans. No wonder Adolf referred to him as his loathsome nephew. William talked about his final meeting with Adolf, which again gives us some insight into Adolf the family man. He wrote, "I shall never forget the last time he sent for me. He was in a brutal temper when I arrived. Walking back and forth, brandishing his horsehide whip, he shouted insults at my head as if he were delivering a political oration. His vengeful brutality on that day made me fear for my physical safety." The reason why Adolf was so furious is that William had opened his mouth again. He published some stories when he was in England and again talked about his uncle. He said in the Look magazine article, "I drove there with friends and was shown into the garden. Hitler was entertaining some very beautiful women at tea. When he saw us, he strode up, slashing a whip as he walked and taking the tops off of the flowers. He took that occasion to warn me to never again mention that I was his nephew." William said Adolf had a tendency to become obsessed with women, after which he would become controlling. He'd intimidate people if he didn't get his own way, but he was also prone to bouts of deep depression. William said something important relating to a mystery that still confounds people today. The answer to this mystery might explain a lot about Adolf Hitler. William said he went back to Berlin in 1931 and something big had happened involving his uncle. William wrote, "The family was in trouble." He said Gayle Raubel, Hitler's half-niece, was dead. William explained everyone knew that Hitler and she had long been intimate and that she had been expecting a child, a fact that enraged Hitler. His revolver was found by her body. As the story goes, and as Hitler told the police, he'd been with his niece at the apartment and then gone to a meeting. When he came back, she was dead with a bullet inside her from his gun. As you know, Adolf wasn't Gayle's real father, but after her biological father died, her mother went to work as a housekeeper for Adolf. Gayle was 17 years old at the time, 19 years younger than Adolf. The question is, was Adolf overstepping his boundaries? Was he in fact having a relationship with her? It's well documented that he was very controlling of her to the extent that some people said he kept her indoors and didn't allow her to date anyone. But that didn't stop her as she ended up dating Adolf's trusted chauffeur, Emil Maurice. When Adolf found out, he put an end to the relationship. He fired Maurice but allowed him to stay in the SS. After this, he barely let Gayle out of his sight. Some people say, despite this, she was the only truly deep love affair of his life. This sounds more believable when you hear what Adolf's right-hand man Hermann Göring said at the Nuremberg trials. Gayle's death had such a devastating effect on Hitler that it changed his relationship to all other people. Not many people knew Adolf Hitler like Göring did. We can trust his remark for its truthfulness. Adolf was certainly obsessed with Gayle, just as he'd been obsessed with his mother. But is this why he killed her? If he killed her? Many people thought Hitler was the killer. After all, she was found with his 6.35mm Walther pistol at her side. They said he'd done it and then laid the pistol next to her. In 1931, Adolf might have been powerful, but he still had a lot of enemies in Germany who were willing to accuse him of murder. Gayle was given what one person called a perfunctory post-mortem, and she was then quickly buried. The Nazi Party propagandists got busy creating tales about her depression, but some who knew her said they didn't believe the stories. This became a huge scandal. Adolf, not surprisingly, was upset about what some of the newspapers were saying about him. He called the stories a terrible smear campaign. He then wrote a story in the Münchner Post, an attempt to put the flames of the scandal out. The newspaper said they'd had a big fight because Gayle wanted to go to Vienna to get engaged to a man, and Adolf had forbidden her to go. In response to that, Adolf wrote, "It is not true that she was going to get engaged in Vienna or that I was against an engagement. It is true that my niece was tormented with the worry that she was not yet fit for her public appearance. She wanted to go to Vienna to have her voice checked once again by a voice teacher." He also wrote, "It is not true that I left my apartment on September 18th after a fierce row. There was no row, no excitement, when I left my apartment on that day." The Nazis then threatened anyone who was thinking about writing more on this story with lawsuits. But one journalist, Fritz Gerlich, didn't back down. He was sure that Adolf had killed Gayle. In March 1933, he was about to publish the evidence he'd collected. Then one night, that spring, Nazi stormtroopers burst into his office, beat him up, and took all the evidence. He was taken to prison and years later executed at Dachau concentration camp. He and others believed that Gayle's nose had been broken before she died. It's also said that she was pregnant either with Adolf's child or someone else's. Either way, this could have led to her death. There has been much speculation about Adolf's sex life. Some people have said that he didn't really have one, that he was asexual. Then there are documents that have been published in various newspaper articles and in one book called The Hidden Hitler that suggested that Adolf was a closeted homosexual, which might explain Nazi homophobia. There is some pretty strong evidence that states he had relationships with men when he was fighting in World War I. There's also some convincing evidence that he killed those who uncovered his secret due to fears of blackmailing. A lawyer who actually got to see Adolf's military files, Erich Ebermeyer, told The Guardian despite his bravery toward the enemy, because of his homosexual activity he lost out on a promotion to non-commissioned officer. Another writer said he allowed the persecution of gays in order to disguise his own true colors. But this doesn't really gel with him having a relationship with his half-niece. Maybe he didn't, but he was definitely possessive of her. One man, Otto Strasser, said he was probably the only guy that Adolf allowed to take Gayle to a dance. He said, "I could feel how much she suffered because of Hitler's jealousy. She was a fun-loving young thing who enjoyed the Mardi Gras excitement in Munich, but was never able to persuade Hitler to accompany her to any of the many wild balls. Finally, during the 1931 Mardi Gras, Hitler allowed me to take Gailey to a ball. He said after the ball they both sat down in a quiet place in an English garden where there was a Chinese tower. She wept uncontrollably, telling him that her uncle Adolf was madly in love with her, but his jealousy drove her around the bend. She wanted to escape. She told Strasser that Adolf asked her to do things that repulsed her, and when Strasser inquired what those things were, all she said was they were the kinds of things you can find in a book called Psychopathia Sexualis. Some of the things she said are too X-rated for YouTube." After she died, he kept a portrait of Gailey next to a portrait of his mother in every one of his rooms, according to the researcher Robert WWII. The thing is, there have been many people like Strasser who've told stories about Adolf Hitler's strange life, and many of the stories just don't match up. But if there is a recurring theme, it's that he was possessive, sometimes paranoid, short-tempered, obsessed with women, starting with his mom, and was at least a tad strange regarding his close relations. Can it be coincidence, then, that few of the women that knew Adolf Hitler in perhaps an intimate way suffered from bouts of depression and obviously didn't want to live anymore? One such woman was actress Renate Müller, who may have been on intimate terms with Adolf. We say may because, again, this is speculation. In 1937, her body was found broken on the street many stories below the room where she'd been staying. Her death certificate said the reason for death was epilepsy, but several people later said they saw Gestapo officers enter her apartment building that night. Had she been in a relationship with Adolf? Some people think she had. Her film director, A. Zeisler, later confirmed this rumor in communications with the American intelligence, and that she was becoming severely distressed over what kinds of things he was asking her to do. Zeisler said that Adolf once fell on the floor and begged her to kick him, condemned himself as unworthy, and just groveled in an agonizing manner. The scene became intolerable to her and she finally acceded to his wishes. As she continued to kick him, he became more and more excited. But can we trust these stories? After all, propaganda works both ways, and there are enough people in the world that wanted and still want to make Adolf Hitler look like a sex-crazed beast. On the other hand, there is a lot more evidence regarding Adolf's addiction to various drugs, including powerful opiates and methamphetamines. He didn't drink booze, he didn't eat badly, but he did like his drugs. This is not speculation. We can see what drugs he took from the notes of journals and his doctor, Theodor Morell. If Adolf did have some strange sexual desires at times, these might have been episodes while he was out of his mind on the Nazi version of crystal meth. Maybe he came down from the meth high with the Nazi version of the opioid oxycodone called Eucodal. Adolf was very likely addicted to Eucodal, at least he took it a lot. Addicts of strong opiates and methamphetamines have their thinking and rationing skills profoundly changed due to the composition of the drugs. Add to this that he was said to have taken a lot of barbiturates, meds that are really ruthless Xanax pills, and, well, all we'll say is getting off those things would have driven Adolf half mad. It's said he also dabbled with cocaine, so we think he took a bunch of chill pills for the come-down. In this regard, it's really not surprising that Adolf Hitler was a bit off his rocker. This is all detailed in the book Blitzed: Drugs in the Third Reich. With all this in mind, there is no doubt that Adolf Hitler was incredibly unhinged. You knew that from all the things he did in his political life. But we hope today you've learned some things you didn't know about his personal life. For sure, some of the rumors might not be true, but there is just too much evidence against him to suggest he lived anything close to a normal life when he was behind four walls. In fact, psychiatrists have tried to diagnose him over the years, and the list of conditions is as long as one of the dead Führer's arms. The conditions include hysteria, histrionic personality disorder, schizophrenia, paranoia, sadistic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, psychopathy, antisocial personality disorder, bipolar disorder, Asperger's syndrome, and schizotypal personality disorder. We'll end this show right here and let you diagnose Mr. Adolf Hitler.
The date is Thursday, October 29, 1914. The Great War, the war to end all wars, rages across Europe and has become a quagmire of trenches dug along hundreds of miles of Central Europe. Artillery barrages sweep from side to side, attempting to drive out the men in those trenches, and victories are measured in inches taken by one side or the other. Always, though, the men return back to their holes, huddling in cold, wet mud as enemy artillery takes revenge for the latest assault. Tens of thousands have already died, and today, fresh recruits move to reinforce the German lines. The men are recently drafted from across Germany's poorer areas and together make up the 3,000-strong 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment. A messenger arrives on horseback bearing critical news. The British have managed to break through German lines, and if they're not stopped, a large part of the front could collapse. The regiment's commanding officer makes a quick decision and barks out orders to his sub-commanders, who blow on whistles to order the men up onto their feet and marching forward at double time. The soldiers hurry the best they can through a forest shattered by artillery barrages and thick with mud, marching to close the gap exploited by the British before a total collapse of this part of the front risks the collapse of Germany's front lines. Through the smoke and fog, though the men of the regiments flanking the Bavarian regiment's march catch only glimpses of gray-green caps, which look from a distance and through a haze a lot like British uniforms. Alarmed, they begin to open fire, unknowingly decimating entire swaths of their own troops. By the time the terrible mistake is realized, the thousands of soldiers are reduced to a few hundred survivors, and in one company, there's only a single man left standing, a 26-year-old soldier by the name of Adolf Hitler. History has well documented the tragedy of Hitler's survival that fateful day, a deed which he repeated numerous times throughout the war, cheating death by incredible margins. Once he was ordered out of a tent where military awards were being presented, only for an artillery shell to strike the tent and reduce it to a crater, with Hitler just outside it. Another time, a gas attack strikes amongst his line, yet Hitler manages to avoid the worst effects of the gas and is only temporarily blinded. While other survivors of the gas succumb by the thousands to disease and injury, Hitler makes a complete recovery and is once more back on the front lines, where another exploding artillery shell buries shrapnel in his leg, but leaves his body whole and otherwise unharmed. For all intents and purposes, Hitler was invincible, uncannily dodging the wrath of a Grim Reaper who every day claimed thousands. As we look at the world that arose from the ashes of World War II, we're prone to asking how much of the peace of the last 80 years would have existed if Hitler had never driven the world into its last major confrontation. War has not been abolished. 5 minutes on any news program will quickly remind you of that fact. Yet the truth is that war between major powers has not occurred since the end of World War II. And after centuries, millennia even, of incessant conflict between major states and empires, it's hard to believe that without World War II's terrible consequences and the ensuing political order, humanity would have simply given up on its lifelong hobby of killing each other as frequently as possible. The fruits that were fertilized in the ashes of World War II have shaped a new world that would be completely alien to any human being born before the 20th century. A world where major powers pursue diplomacy over war and imperial ambitions are kept in check by a strong alliance of liberal democracies. World War II gave us the United Nations, an agency that rose from the rubble of the League of Nations, and gave it a grim determination to avoid conflict thanks to the League's many failures. Without World War II, the world's first attempt to unify its governments would have failed, and the old order of shifting alliances and constant conflict would have returned. The war also gave us two rival superpowers who held the planet at risk of total annihilation for decades. Yet it's important to note that it was the two specific superpowers who rose to prominence, the United States and the Soviet Union. Two opposing ideologies, democracy versus communism. In a world where violence between communists, federalists, imperialists, and Democrats had raged for decades. In Germany alone, political groups split between the left and the right had been killing themselves for years after the fall of the Kaiser and his empire. And the violence repeated across the whole of Europe as communism found allies in parties of workers oppressed and exploited by runaway capitalism. It's easy for modern observers to be ignorant of the extreme violence between these two ideologies and of the consequence of the two major powers arising from World War II with the means to annihilate each other along with the world, and both radically shifted on opposite ends of the political spectrum. Yet again, it was specifically the United States and the Soviet Union who arose from World War II, two powers who were almost equally matched in every regard. The United States maintained a nuclear advantage while the Soviet Union maintained a conventional power advantage. Both sides found themselves facing the threat of total defeat in any conflict, and thus an equilibrium was achieved, one which actively prevented all-out hostilities on several occasions and rescued the world from Armageddon during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Without Hitler, it's unlikely that it would have been the evenly matched Soviet Union and the United States who rose to prominence, and this imbalance would almost certainly have led to all-out conflict.
either because one side believed itself capable of achieving complete victory through nuclear weapons, or because the weaker side believed it would be forever dominated if it did not strike first with nuclear weapons, while it could still potentially win the conflict. There would have existed a tipping point in history between the two rivals, where the larger power reached a point that if the smaller power did not act immediately, it would never again be able to act to overthrow it. The larger power would have also been aware of this point, would have been aware of its approach, and would have had every incentive to launch a surprise attack on the smaller power first in order to annihilate it. The world would have gone up in nuclear fire. This point existed also between the US and the Soviet Union. Sometime around the mid-1950s, when the Soviet Union began the mass production of atomic weapons and testing on long-range rockets to deliver them intercontinentally. The US was itself greatly behind the Soviets in rocket technology, but had far surpassed them in long-range bombers. If the Soviet Union closed the nuclear gap by developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, it would forever eliminate the US's only nuclear advantage over the Soviet Union. Many within the American military argued for a surprise nuclear attack on the Soviet Union, believing that war was ultimately unavoidable and that this might be the only chance to win it with minimal damage to the United States. Sure, Europe would be reduced to nuclear rubble, but only a few American cities could possibly be hit by Russian long-range bombers, and even this was unlikely. The Soviet Union would be crushed under nuclear rubble, and the world would be free of the threat of a major all-out nuclear war forever, even if it cost the whole of Europe. Thankfully, the American presidents didn't listen to their military commanders, and of course we now understand the consequences of nuclear war far better than we did back then. We know, for instance, that while the United States would have been completely spared any atomic attacks, it and the rest of the world would have been starved to death in the ensuing nuclear winter as trillions of tons of debris shrouded the world for years. We know that global weather patterns would have eventually carried massive plumes of radioactive fallout as far as the American East Coast, potentially making large swaths of the eastern seaboard uninhabitable for decades, perhaps longer. The world would die a cold, dark death, and the survivors would find little land free of the poison of radiation on which to grow their crops once the sun returned a decade or more later. It was Hitler and his rise to power and the war and atrocities he committed that gave pause to the American presidents being compelled to strike out at the Soviet Union. But it was also the fact that their enemy was in fact the Soviet Union, a nation powerful enough to have a level of parity with the United States. Once more, had it not been these two specific nations that rose from World War II, the odds of an uneven matched set of superpowers are almost a certainty. But who could have arisen? Without Hitler, Germany's fate could have taken a threefold path. The constitutional democracy that arose after the fall of the Kaiser was unstable, and the president tried daily to maintain a balance between the opposing political parties. Democratic socialists and full-blown communists made up a large segment of the left seats in the German parliament, and hardline Nazis and imperialist nationalists made up equally large segments in the right seats in parliament. Not only were the two sides opposed to each other, the parties were all completely opposed to one another as well, leaving German democracy so unstable that 2 elections were called for in 1932 alone. This leaves the possibility of 3 paths for Germany without Hitler. Germany could have become a strong liberal democracy, which would have found itself closely allied with the democracies of Britain and France. This would have left the entirety of Western Europe in direct opposition to the expansion of communist Eastern Europe. Without a world war to weaken Germany and draw the United States into European affairs, the US would have remained as it was at the outbreak of World War II, isolationist and content to let Europe fight out its own problems. Hostilities between East and West were all but inevitable, and even during World War II, the British considered for the entirety of the war launching offensives against the Soviet Union after the fall of Germany. Hitler was fully aware of these hostilities, and when he launched his famous counterattack against the Allies pressing into Germany, which resulted in iconic battles such as the Battle of the Bulge, his strategy had in fact been not to completely defeat the British and Americans, but to hand them such a defeat just large enough that they agreed to a ceasefire. After the ceasefire, he hoped to talk the two sides into joining him against the Soviet Union, and was confident enough in this plan to consider it a likely path to a German exit from World War II. With a German liberal democracy, World War II may have been postponed a few years, but would have still taken place, albeit without the United States involving itself. Given Germany's initial lead in developing the nuclear bomb, the West would have used these bombs the moment they became available, devastating the European countryside.
With its vast reserves of manpower, though, the Soviets could have held out long enough for their spies to steal the secrets of the bomb and respond with their own in a few years. The devastating nuclear escalation would have led to a global climate catastrophe. Germany, however, could also have become an imperialist state once again. The German president during the early 1930s, Paul von Hindenburg, actually made Hitler chancellor because he expected Hitler to crush his political rivals and place the nation back on the path to imperialism. This historical outcome would very closely match a Germany of a third option, one where Hitler died in World War I and the Nazi Party gave the chancellorship to a much more competent and psychologically stable man. With Germany rising once more as an imperial power or as a fascist state with a more capable version of Hitler, it's indubitable that the nation would have launched the same offensives as it did the days before the official start of World War II. This would have prompted the same response from Britain and France and the same start to World War II. The difference this time, however, would have been a military leader who respected the opinions of his generals, who would not have foolishly launched an attack against the Soviet Union until it had secured Western Europe completely, and who would have practiced war with a more careful and tactfully sound approach. A more capable German Führer, or Kaiser, for example, would not have called for a halt to the German forces on their way to completely crush the British as they tried to flee at Dunkirk. A strategic mistake by Hitler, which would have irrevocably changed the course of the war for the Allies for the worse. Without Hitler and the rise of a capable Führer or Kaiser, Germany would have been an unstoppable war machine, which would have crushed the Allies before the United States could join the fight. Then, Germany could have turned its full might against the Soviet Union, which, facing only roughly half of Germany's power, still suffered near defeat in our real World War II. Facing the full strength of the Wehrmacht alone, the Soviets would have quickly fallen, and the German Empire or Third Reich would lay claim to all of Europe. Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and countless other European nations would exist only as governments in exile inside the United States. A different Cold War would have fallen on the planet, one where the United States faced off across the Atlantic against a Germany far more powerful than itself. Its only choice being nuclear war now or total and complete subjugation forever. The Holy Bible states that God works all things for good, and given the possibilities of a Germany without Hitler, it can be hard to argue that indeed history did turn out for the best despite the horrors of World War II. Millions of lives were lost, yet in the killing, it's likely that billions of lives were saved. And instead of a war of nuclear annihilation or a continuation of the incessant warmongering between major powers, we inherited a world of relative international peace. Our conflicts between major powers limited to small proxy wars in faraway corners of the world, and largely cultural and economic in nature. We never thought we'd say this, but thank God for Hitler.
The villain stares up at the plans for the powerful weapon. This is no ordinary gun or rocket. When complete, it'll harness the power of the sun itself and rain fire and death down on his enemies. A mad scientist looking for revenge on a superhero? No, the villain was Nazi leader Adolf Hitler, and this weapon and many others were really built or planned by his scientists. What was the Wunderwaffe? The secret German program of wonder weapons? It was 1942 and the Nazi war machine was flagging. The United States had entered the war, the United Kingdom was stubbornly refusing to fall, and Hitler had the brilliant idea of invading Russia, which meant the German army now had to fight a war on two fronts. The morale of the military was fading. Hitler was devoting more and more resources toward targeting German citizens, and even many of his own generals were starting to whisper. Was the Führer losing his marbles? Did Germany need a change in leadership? Naturally, that meant there was only one thing to do: turn up the propaganda. Led by Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda ministry started putting out news that would help turn the tide of the war. Because Germany's scientists were on the case and they were designing a whole new crop of Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapons, that the world had never seen before. These weapons, straight out of science fiction in some cases, were said to pack a power the world has never seen. 3 years before the first atomic bombs were perfected, these secret weapons were said to turn the tide of any war and send the enemy running. So, was there any truth to these announcements? As usual, the answer is yes and no. The Germans did in fact have a top-secret weapons program, and it was led by some of the world's best scientists. Men like Werner von Braun, the aerospace engineer who was later taken out of Germany by the United States and became one of the heads of the space program, regularly presented Hitler with blueprints for wildly ambitious weapons. The only thing standing between Germany and unleashing these beasts on the battlefield was a lack of time and money, and Hitler was more than willing to give both of these to the Wunderwaffe program. and the results were impressive, at least on paper. The Wunderwaffe program went for quantity over quality in many cases, and they delivered designs and prototypes for countless new weapons. Some delivered the foundation of future weapons and innovations that swept the world. Others were created but didn't live up to the initial hype. Still others were designed on paper, but the German army ran out of time before they became a reality. And yet others turned into complete and total disasters that we still marvel at today. Let's crack open the secret files of the Wunderwaffe and see which of these innovations succeeded and which terrified even Hitler. Germany had an impressive navy, but they were far behind the Allied powers in one area: aircraft carriers. Hitler wanted to expand Germany's naval power far beyond Europe, and to do that, they needed much more capacity. So they commissioned the Graf Zeppelin, a massive carrier that could have carried over 40 fighter planes and dive bombers. And it was one of the earliest Wunderwaffe projects, beginning construction in 1936, and it was still under construction in 1945. With Germany's defeat imminent, the ship was deliberately sunk to avoid it falling into enemy hands. It was later salvaged and used for weapons tests by the Soviets, a far cry from the powerhouse it was intended to be. But it wasn't the most impressive aircraft carrier in the Nazis' plans. The German ocean liner Europa was an impressive ship, one of the largest of the era. After losing a key battleship in 1941, the German Navy needed an aircraft carrier they could use quickly. So they came up with the idea, why not turn the cruise ship into a carrier? The largest of the vessels was chosen for conversion. The Europa was redesigned the German aircraft carrier 1, and big plans were developed to convert it. And that's all they became, plans. Soon after the process began, it became clear there were serious structural weaknesses, and the ship wasn't meant to carry airplanes. It wound up carrying troops after it was seized by the United States. If there was one thing the Wunderwaffe program loved, it was large ships. It was called Plan Z, the plan to expand and enhance the German Navy starting in 1939. The plans were always ambitious, but never quite panned out, and that included the H-class battleships. Never heard of the H-class battleships? That's because they were designed to be by far the largest the German Navy had ever seen, with 6 ships loaded with massive guns and reinforced deck armor. Ironically, what spelled their end was the very thing they were designed for: World War II. The Navy's focus went to retrofitting existing ships, and the H-class battleships faded off into the seas of fantasy. But one section of the German Navy got much more attention. The U-boat was the terror of the seas, as the German submarines sank countless Allied ships, but Hitler wanted them to be faster, stronger, and deadlier. Countless new models were proposed, starting with the rocket U-boat. Most U-boats use standard torpedoes, but these blueprints intended to replace that with higher-powered rockets and missiles. This would allow the Germans to not only sink enemy ships more effectively, but potentially launch attacks on Britain and even the United States from the sea. The first tests were promising, but the lack of a guidance system made them ineffective. Ultimately, the rocket U-boat wasn't ready for combat by the time the war ended, but the scientists continued to refine them for other countries. There was a constant quest to upgrade the U-boat, and some got closer than others. The biggest challenge of using submarines in combat was that they weren't meant to stay underwater at length. They had to coast along the surface and could only submerge for short periods at a time. The Type 21 submarines aimed to change that, being the first ships to operate primarily underwater and only need to resurface for charging. The prototypes worked, and they were put into production in a hurry. Over 100 were completed and 2 were put into service, but at that point the sea war of the European front was all but over. Neither ship saw combat, but the design was impressive enough that both the US and USSR built on it in the future. But the designs that were meant for the surface were no less ambitious or strange. The Kugelblitz might sound like a falling rain of noodle puddings, but the World War II reality was much different. A planned anti-aircraft weapon, it was a self-propelled gun that would be attached to tanks and had the ability to shoot down enemy planes from the ground. It was the first model to have an enclosed rotating turret that would give it far greater maneuverability. The plans were approved to move it to the prototype phase, but that's where the project concluded as the war ended and only a few test vehicles had been completed. The only surviving turret stands on display at a German Army museum. But to take down tanks, the German Army would need some bigger guns. Literally. A rare example of a Wunderwaffe weapon that actually saw combat, the Sturer Emil anti-tank gun was an impressive beast. A lengthy run mounted on the hull of an armored tank, it could carry 15 rounds and move enough to aim effectively. The tank design was adjusted from standard heavy tanks to balance the huge barrel, and 2 models were completed and sent into the field. Named after Max and Moritz, a pair of German storybook characters, they both fell in combat, with Max being destroyed and Moritz being captured by the Soviets and placed on display in the Kubinka Tank Museum. And to carry a heavy gun, you need a heavy tank. The German heavy tank programs cranked out powerful weapons, but they wanted to go bigger. The largest tank at the time, the Panzer VII Maus, was under 200 tons. However, the planned Land Cruiser Ratte was going to weigh a whopping 1,000 tons. Its Its armor would be almost 10 inches thick and covered with anti-aircraft guns along with a gun turret harvested from a battleship. Hitler was impressed with the wild ambition of the project and greenlit it, always being a fan of showy weapons. However, Minister of Armaments Albert Speer saw it for what it was, a massive money pit, and canceled the project in 1943 before it was built. Other tanks were less ambitious but no more effective. Although the Landkruiser was never completed, its smaller cousin, the famous Panzer VIII Maus, was. The behemoth of a tank still holds the record for the heaviest fully enclosed armored vehicle ever created. Over 30 feet long and almost 12 feet high, weighing in at just under 200 metric tons, it's armed with a powerful anti-tank gun. The problem was, at that size and weight, it took a lot of power to run. It could reach a top speed of up to 14 miles per hour, but it was too heavy to even cross most bridges. The tank had to ford the river using a snorkel. It was designed for power and spectacle, not maneuverability, which no doubt led to its eventual capture by the Soviet forces. But it wasn't the most bizarre tank in the Nazis' plans. You've probably seen a tumbleweed rolling down the plains. What if that tumbleweed was made of metal instead? The Nazis designed a bizarre rolling tank known as the Kugelpanzer as part of the Wunderwaffe program, but the incomplete model recovered from the field left more questions than it answered. It didn't have any weapons attached, and it seemed to be more of a mobile bunker than a tank. While it didn't seem to have much combat use, it certainly became a star exhibit in the Kubinka Tank Museum. And their plans for the air were no less ambitious. Military gliders were one of the most important parts of warfare, getting troops and supplies to where they were needed most. The Junkers Ju-332 Mammut was the largest glider the Germans tried to build, and there was a hitch to the plan. It was supposed to be built out of non-strategic material to aid the war effort, so the German Luftwaffe tried to build the entire thing out of wood. It was planned to carry up to 4,400 pounds of cargo. Early tests showed the vehicle was incredibly unstable. It landed well before its planned destination and had to be towed back, its eventual fate being cut up for fuel. One area of the German weapons program got more attention than any other. It was a constant frustration for Hitler. For all the German army's strength, he was sorely lacking in air power. Germany hadn't been involved in long-range wars before the last few decades, and their air force was dwarfed by those of the United States and Japan. They were engaged in aerial combat against Great Britain, but their planes weren't capable of striking further off targets or getting involved in the Pacific theater. The Wunderwaffe program was designed to change that, and their program had an in-your-face name, America Bomber. Doesn't leave much doubt what this thing was intended to do, does it? Germany wanted a long-range bomber that would be capable of delivering a Pearl Harbor-like attack against the East Coast American cities, especially New York, which Hitler fantasized about destroying. The German Air Ministry gathered several of the country's best aircraft designers to submit their own candidates for the plane that could deliver a shocking punch to the US on their home front. The results were mixed. Ultimately, two designs stood out from the crowd and were destined for production. The first, the Messerschmitt Me-264, was a long-range strategic bomber for the Luftwaffe. It was an all-metal heavy bomber similar in design to the B-52 and had relatively little in the way of armor and guns, so it could carry more bombs. 3 prototypes were built and overall impressed the brass, but Messerschmitt was already under a lot of demand for their fighter planes, and so the project was abandoned and the competitor was chosen. And that competitor packed its own impressive payload. Junkers might have had a flop with its massive wooden glider, but their other models were anything but. The Junkers Ju-390 was the model ultimately chosen for the America Bomber project for one main reason. It could be adapted from some of their existing planes. Extra inner wing segments were added to the classic Junkers Ju-90 and 290 models, and they quickly went into testing. But how successful they were is a subject of ongoing debate. Some say the test plane made secret flights to South Africa, Japan, and even New York, but there is no concrete proof of this. What's clear is that work on them continued into 1944 until their contracts were canceled, and the planes were eventually stripped for parts and destroyed. But the Nazis might have been more interested in one specific device. The future of warcraft was rockets, powerful devices that could provide fast launches from the ground and deliver massive payloads, or even take a man to the moon one day. Wernher von Braun was known as the master of rockets, and many of his innovations were rocket-powered. Hundreds of designs were built for jet fighters, rocket-powered planes, bombers, ramming interceptors, and tactical bombers, but the jet fuel needed to power rockets was expensive, and the technology was new, and most of the Nazi rocket projects wound up as little more than expensive proof-of-concept displays for von Braun's future career. Although Hitler liked rockets, one thing's for sure, he liked heavy artillery more, and the Wunderwaffe program was happy to deliver. Why launch 100 mortars when you can launch one with 10 times the power? That was what Karl Gerhardt tried to answer. The massive siege mortar fired the largest self-propelled ammunition ever deployed, and 6 of the massive guns were built. The destination? The Eastern Front, where Russia had a massive terrain and manpower advantage over the invading Germans. The gun was even powerful enough to destroy bridges when deployed, but they were slow-moving and expensive to build. They delivered a powerful punch, but ultimately all but one were destroyed, and the remainder found its final destination at, you guessed it, the Kubinka Tank Museum. But bigger isn't always better. The Schwere Gustav was one of the most impressive guns ever built, weighing in almost 1,500 short tons and able to fire shells close to 30 miles. It was less a gun than a massive tank-like railway weapon that turned out to be the largest gun ever fired in combat. The problem is, massive guns don't just wind up where you'd like them to be without help. Getting the Schwere Gustav to where it was supposed to be took a lot of time and manpower, which gave the enemy a lot of time to surround the German position and attack. It was a powerful weapon, but not a practical one, and was eventually destroyed to keep it from falling into enemy hands. But there was one gun that would have been even more powerful. Many of the Wunderwaffe projects never left the drawing board due to a lack of money or time, and that was the case for the Land Cruiser P-1500 Monster, a super heavy self-propelled gun that would have roamed the battlefield on a pair of treads. Weighing around 1,500 tons, it would allow a massive gun like the Gustav to travel without being assembled by a team of soldiers. The problem was, well, Nazis' tank development wasn't exactly going well. Vehicles like the Maus turned out to be a disaster, so rolling a giant gun around on 2 of those wasn't likely to go smoothly. It would also be an inviting target for air attacks. The monster was cancelled before it even got off the ground, and little documentation of it exists. Some Wunderwaffe projects were a little more practical. It was the early days of air warfare, and planes were expensive to make, so why not make them harder to shoot down? That was the goal of the Jagdfaust, an experimental anti-bomber rifle that would be equipped for German rocket planes. The Comet, the Luftwaffe's fastest plane, moved so fast that it made typical cannon rounds much harder, making accuracy a real problem for its pilots. The Jagdfaust eliminated that problem by eliminating the recoil and allowing it to be fired much faster. And unlike many German engineering projects, it worked. The gun got its first kill in April 1945. Too little, too late, as the war came to an end. The only thing more valuable than a new weapon was preserving existing ones. Losing expensive hardware was a common problem, especially when it was tanks, which the Nazis were constantly trying to upgrade. The massive weapons were especially vulnerable at night when they could be ambushed from the dark, which was why the German optics company Carl Zeiss AG developed a surprising project for the military in 1941. The FG-1250 was one of the first night vision devices ever built, working through infrared and designed to be mounted on tanks. It was one of the more effective devices, maybe proving that larger isn't always better. For many weapons, the key wasn't going bigger but smarter. It was the precursor in many ways to modern drone warfare, a weapon that wouldn't need to be aimed directly at the target but could be guided to it. The Fritz X was a powerful bomb designed to take out heavily armed targets, but what made it unique was that it was the first precision-guided weapon ever used in combat. The bomb would be guided by a radio-controlled link that affected movable parts in the tail fins and was intended to sink ships. It successfully achieved that goal in 1943, but it wouldn't be long before the Allies developed countermeasures that could interfere with the delicate radio link. Some Wunderwaffe projects, though, were distinctly closer to science fiction. It was 1929 when German physicist Hermann Oberth came up with a mad proposal, a massive space station that would use a concave mirror to concentrate sunlight and refract it back at a specific point of the Earth with devastating results. Germany was not at war at this point, so maybe he just wanted to be a supervillain. But during the Second World War, German scientists began to build on the concept. They wanted to design a massive sun gun that would generate an immense amount of energy, enough to destroy a city with a single blast. The only problem was Germany didn't have a space program. No one did. When asked how long it would take to build their sun gun, they estimated between 50 and 100 years, which, when you consider Hitler's plans for a 1,000-year Reich, might have been reasonable. But how bizarre were the projects of the Wunderwaffe truly? What was Die Glocke? The mysterious bell-shaped superweapon was one of the most mysterious supposed projects of the Wunderwaffe. It was exposed by Polish journalist Igor Witkowski in the year 2000, as he claimed he had uncovered a secret device that never saw the light of day. Some claimed the glowing contraption was an anti-gravity device, with some even saying it could be related to time travel. But in reality, all evidence is that Die Glocke was nothing. There's no evidence that Witkowski was exposing a true project instead of creating a clever tale. Other devices promises never got close to reality. The Wunderwaffe teams repeatedly came back to the idea of a directed energy weapon. Who wouldn't like a gun that never ran out of ammo, just needing to be recharged? That technology for Star Trek phasers wasn't there yet, but that didn't stop them from trying. The first attempt was a sonic cannon that could kill via high-intensity vibrations. It worked, but was too expensive and vulnerable to enemy fire to become a mainstay of combat. Undeterred, Hitler's mad scientists explored X-ray beams that could take down aircraft, but the electron accelerator they built as a test was eventually captured by the Americans. But one question has puzzled people for decades: how close did the Wunderwaffe get to the ultimate weapon? Nuclear fission was discovered in 1938, and only 4 months later, Hitler already had scientists working on a short-lived nuclear bomb project. While it was shut down shortly before the Nazi invasion of Poland, a new project would soon begin as the Nazis started producing nuclear reactors, uranium, and heavy water in earnest. The project continued to be funded until the very end of the war, but contrary to popular belief, it was not a tight race for which side got to the finish line first. While the Manhattan Project was full steam ahead, the German nuclear bomb project was understaffed, and many of the scientists left to pursue more short-term war projects. It didn't help that many of Germany's top scientists had fled the Nazi regime. In the end, the Nazi nuclear bomb project met the fate of many other superweapons, being harvested for parts by the Allies as they took over after the war. So what went wrong with the Wunderwaffe? Why did a project that created so many fantastical weapons ultimately deliver so many duds and completely fail to help the country win the war? For one thing, the scientists involved had to split their focus between so many projects that few got the opportunity to develop and be refined. Many were scrapped after one failed test. Torn between Hitler's mad ambition and Albert Speer's penny pinching, the scientists were often between a rock and a hard place. While many did change the future of warfare, few were around long enough to deliver in combat, and those that were often rolled out right before the close of the war. But one place is no doubt thankful for the Wunderwaffe, the Kubinka Tank Museum, which thanks them for many of their top exhibits. Stefan Novak's heart beats rapidly in his chest as he approaches the Nazi checkpoint. Heavily armored SS soldiers check each person's papers before they're allowed to enter the heart of the Nazi Empire. Stefan watches in horror as a man is pulled from the line screaming. He's thrown to the ground. The man pleads with the Nazis to spare his life, that the Star of David burned into his arm was just a mistake. He really isn't Jewish. But the Nazis don't listen. The commander pulls his pistol out of its holster and shoots the man in the chest. Stefan shows no emotion as he watches the innocent man die. He knows that if he's going to successfully infiltrate the lands of the Third Reich, he needs to maintain his cover. Stefan has been working tirelessly to assume his new identity, one that will allow him to move freely across the European continent, which is now completely controlled by Adolf Hitler. Before the Nazis won the war in Europe, Stefan was a resistance fighter in the Polish army, but now there is no war to fight. The Nazis have full control of Europe, and Stefan only has one thing on his mind: to find his wife and daughter before they're worked to death in a concentration camp or executed for being related to an enemy of the Nazi state. As the war came to an end, Stefan received word from Polish underground forces that his wife and daughter had been taken by the Nazis and put on a train to work in one of the slave camps somewhere in the empire. He immediately called in all of his favors to secure fake documents and uncover as much of his information on his family's whereabouts as possible. The good news is he knows where to start his search. The bad news is that the start point is in Berlin, the heart of the Nazi Empire. Stefan reaches the front of the line. The Nazi soldier asks for his papers. He keeps his eyes on the ground as a sign of fear, even though he would be more than capable of snapping the Nazi's neck and taking out a few of his comrades in the process. But he must remain undercover if he has any hope of locating his wife and daughter. The soldier is quiet for a moment as he looks over the papers. "What business do you have in the capital?" the Nazi asks. "I wish to give my life to the Third Reich. I was a stonemason before the war, and I know the Fuhrer is in need of hardworking men to complete his vision for Germania," Stefan replies. The Nazi grunts. "Polish scum," he says. "Very well, continue on." The Nazi slams Stefan's papers into his chest, slightly pushing him backward, and points to where he should go. It takes everything Stefan has not to punch the Nazi in the face, but he knows what the consequences of such an action would be. He continues through the checkpoint and boards a bus for Berlin. The bus drives through the Nazi countryside. It looks untouched by the war. The Nazis work quickly, and it's helped that they now have a gigantic pool of slave labor to pull from in order to rebuild their roads and buildings. Anyone who does not conform to Hitler's vision of the Aryan race is treated as a second-class citizen. Anyone belonging to ethnic minority groups such as the Jews are enslaved and either worked to death or killed as part of the Nazis' mass genocide program. The bus enters what was once Berlin. The city has been transformed into Hitler's megacity called Germania. Everywhere Stefan looks, he sees statues dedicated to Nazi leaders and generals. Grand buildings made of marble quarried by slaves rise from the ground like mountains. The city seems to have popped up overnight thanks to the millions of forced laborers Hitler and his architects had at their disposal. The sight of swastikas and Nazi symbols on every building and street corner makes Stefan sick. The bus comes to a stop in the heart of the city. Stefan gets off. He has instructions from one of the informants in the Polish underground network to pick up more information on the whereabouts of his family in a newly constructed housing complex. He heads there immediately and finds a small eagle representing the Polish coat of arms etched into one of the stones of the building. Stefan pushes the stone. It moves slightly to reveal a hidden compartment. In it is a set of papers that indicate his wife and daughter have been sent to the east. Early in the war, the Nazis reached an agreement with the Soviet Union, saying that they would stay out of the war in exchange for Hitler not invading their country. Hitler had no intention of upholding his end of the bargain, but he needed time to focus his efforts on defeating the Allied forces in France. Once this mission was complete, he launched Operation Sea Lion across the English Channel into Britain. The Allied forces in Britain were still recovering from the Dunkirk invasion and were no match for the Nazi blitzkrieg. Britain fell soon after. Now it's ruled by Hermann Göring, one of Hitler's top generals and good friends. Göring is a monster who has turned Britain into his own private island. He has luxury goods imported from around the empire and throws lavish parties for his Nazi comrades in what was once Buckingham Palace. Resources from Britain are sent back to Germany as tribute to Hitler, but for all intents and purposes, Göring is the new King of England. He must do exactly what the Führer orders. But in return, he has free reign of the British Isles and is quickly stripping them of their resources while oppressing their people. As soon as Hitler controlled all of Western Europe and defeated British military forces, he turned his attention toward the Soviet Union. The Nazis coordinated an attack with Japan, who struck from the west, while their forces pushed across Eastern Europe and into Russia from the opposite direction. All Hitler really wanted was the territory up to the Ural Mountains. Eventually, he would take over the world, but this would complete the first stage of his plan and put all of Europe under his control. Stefan puts the stone back in its place and heads to the train station, where he purchases a ticket for the Nazi territories in what was once the Soviet Union. When Hitler defeated the Allies in Europe, he annexed Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. Most of the populations in these regions conformed to his definition of what the human race should look like. There were resistance fighters who tried to protect the freedom of all peoples in these nations, but they were quickly disposed of by the SS. Now the Dutch and Scandinavian governments are puppets for Hitler to do with as he pleases. However, the people in the former Soviet Union aren't so lucky. Stefan looks out the window of the train car as the lands east of Germany seem more like hell than earth. The landscape has been ravaged for its resources. Hitler had no intentions of incorporating the people of the Soviet Union into his empire. All he wants to do is use them as slave labor and harvest the oil, metal, and timber from their land. Stefan feels sick to his stomach as he passes ghost town after ghost town. Buildings are in ruin from the war. People are living in houses missing entire walls. After days of traveling, the train jerks to a stop and Stefan gets off. The air is cold, but the smell of smoke fills his nose. He looks down the road and sees the fencing of a work camp where thousands of people are being held. He follows the procession of new laborers that were on board the train with him, but at the last minute ducks into a thick patch of bushes that sits on the edge of the tree line. He waits for the Nazi guards who are escorting the group to enter the camp before he starts making his way toward the fencing. Stefan peers into the camp. SS and newly conscripted Russian soldiers who are sympathetic to the Nazi cause shout out orders at the workers. Many are malnourished or are nothing but skin and bone. Anyone who's seen by the Nazis as having an inferior bloodline or belonging to an ethnic minority is used for slave labor. Unfortunately, this constitutes anyone from Russia. Stefan makes eye contact with one of the men walking toward the barracks. The man's face is covered in dirt. He can barely stand up straight from exhaustion. Stefan recognizes this man. He was a soldier in the resistance. They had conducted a few missions together. The former ally looks around to see if anyone's watching and then makes his way to the fence. "Stefan, what are you doing here?" he whispers. "I'm looking for Tony and my daughter. An informant told me they've been taken to this camp." The man's expression becomes even more somber. He shakes his head back and forth. "I'm so very sorry, Stefan," he says. "Your wife and daughter were loaded into a transport a week ago. The Nazis are diverting people to the coast of France as they plan for the attack on the United States." Stefan's heart breaks. He's silent for a moment. How were they? Had they been hurt by these Nazi bastards? "No," the man on the other side of the fence responds. "They were weak, like all of us, but they were in relatively good health when they left. I'm sorry, Stefan. I wish I had better." Suddenly, a gunshot rings out. The former resistance fighter's eyes open wide. Stefan reaches out through the fence to steady him. Blood trickles from the man's mouth as he falls to the ground. Stefan looks up. Several Nazi guards are running toward him with their guns raised. Stefan turns and sprints to the forest. He weaves through the trees, trying to put as much distance between him and the Nazi camp as possible. He hears the sounds of dogs barking and men shouting from behind him. Stefan pushes his body as far as it'll go. He knows that if he's captured, his hopes of seeing his wife and child again would be crushed. Stefan spots a tree with thick branches and abundant foliage. He darts toward it and leaps off the ground, grabbing onto one of the branches. He begins to climb higher and higher into the tree. If he can hide there until the Nazis pass, he may be able to get out of this alive. Moments later, several dogs appear. They bark and growl as they run past the tree Stefan is hiding in. He lets out a sigh of relief, but it's premature. The dogs realize they've lost his scent and backtrack toward the tree he's hiding in. They begin sniffing all around the tree. The Nazi soldiers catch up and begin looking for Stefan. He closes his eyes and prays he's not discovered. Yelling can be heard from another part of the forest. The Nazis turn their heads to listen. They give new commands to the dogs, who stop sniffing around the tree and sprint toward the sound of the shouting. The Nazi soldiers follow. Stefan stays in the tree for what feels like hours. When he finally climbs down, the sun is set and the frigid night air is quiet. He makes his way back toward the train tracks, where he waits for a transport to pass by. The sound of a locomotive can be heard off in the distance. Then a behemoth of a train comes into view. Stefan runs out of the forest as fast as he can. He times his jump perfectly and grabs onto one of the handles of the train. It takes every ounce of strength, but Stefan manages to slide the car door open and falls into the train car. It's carrying supplies toward Western Europe, where they'll be used to launch an attack across the Atlantic. The clicking and clacking of the train on the tracks is like a lullaby. Stefan doesn't know exactly where this train is headed, but he knows it's at least bringing him closer to finding his wife and child. Stefan blacks out from exhaustion. When he awakes, the train is still crossing the former Soviet Union. By the angle of the sun, it seems as if it's traveling due west, but slightly to the south. This isn't ideal, but he is relatively safe on board the train, and he knows it'll eventually make its way to the west coast to deliver the supplies. Several more days go by. Stefan survives off the stores of grain that have been packed aboard the train. Whenever it rains, he catches the precious liquid in a Nazi helmet he found in one of the crates. As the sun rises a week after he snuck aboard the train, an ominous sight comes into view. In the distance, Stefan can see gigantic snow-covered peaks jutting up from the landscape. He knows these must be the Alps. He's now in a newly formed Roman Empire. As the train travels through the countryside, Stefan sees a mix of Nazi and Italian soldiers at different checkpoints. When Hitler conquered Northern Europe and the Western Soviet Union, he allowed Mussolini to control the lands that were once under the control of the Roman Empire. However, it's clear that Mussolini is not really in control. In fact, he isn't even allowed to make his own decisions. He almost cost the Nazis the war in Southern Europe, and now Hitler uses him as a figurehead while he controls the nation. There's been recent contention between the Italian puppet government and Hitler, as the Italians try to hold on to their Roman Catholic religion. Hitler, on the other hand, wants to dismantle Christianity and organized religion completely. His tension has caused the Nazis to deploy forces around the new Roman Empire to make the transition to a state ideology go more smoothly. Hitler is adamant that the only allegiance and belief system anyone in his empire should have is to him and the Nazi Party. The train Stefan is hiding on reaches the coast of what was once southern France. He looks across the Mediterranean. On the other side of these waters is northern Africa, which is also under the control of the Nazis. Once the Allied forces in Europe were defeated, the Nazi army faced little to no resistance while invading other parts of the world. Hitler had no interest in building up infrastructure in North Africa, but he's incredibly interested in its resources, especially oil. Stefan closes his eyes and thinks about his wife and daughter. His train has now begun to travel northwest. Soon it'll reach the western coast of Hitler's empire. After the Nazis defeated Britain and the Soviet Union, Hitler turned his attention towards Spain. He appreciated what Francisco Franco was doing in the country, but there could only be one dictator in Europe, and it was going to be him. Hitler ordered his Luftwaffe to carry out bombing runs on key targets in Spain and Portugal, followed by a series of infantry invasions. Both countries quickly fell, and Franco's pleas to remain the leader of Spain fell on deaf ears. As a sign of respect for his fellow dictator, Hitler did not execute Franco but exiled him to South America instead. The Nazis immediately began constructing railways through the country all the way to the Strait of Gibraltar, where a massive fortress was created to guard the entrance to the Mediterranean. New docks were also created to allow for easy transportation of goods and natural resources from Africa onto mainland Europe. Stefan feels the train begin to slow and prepares to jump off before it reaches the station. This is no ordinary Nazi outpost. The final destination of this train is Brest, in what used to be France. It's from this region that Hitler will launch his aerial assault of the eastern United States. The Brittany Peninsula has been converted into one big airfield full of America bombers and other long-range aircraft. Stefan tucks and rolls off the train right before it crosses into a heavily guarded train yard, where the supplies aboard will be offloaded. The French countryside has been completely demolished, and in its place are factories and airfields as far as anyone can see. Trains and transports run constantly from Germany to the western coast of Europe, as the only real threat to Hitler's domination of the world is the US. Many French people have been enlisted to aid in the war effort. Their armies fell quickly after the initial invasion of the country by the Nazi panzer and infantry divisions. Stefan breaks into a nearby house to steal clothing and food before setting out to locate his wife and daughter in the various work camps in the area. He's surprised to find a Nazi SS uniform in one of the drawers, and even though the outfit goes against everything he stands for, he puts it on, as brown cloth with the swastika stitched on the arm will allow him to move freely to search for his family. A belt with a holster hangs on the back of one of the doors. In the holster is a Luger with a full clip. Stefan knows if he has to use the pistol, it'll likely be the last thing he ever does, but having a weapon might come in handy if he runs into serious trouble. The new reality of Hitler's Europe is that no matter where anyone goes, there are always concentration camps set up to provide a free source of labor. The main group of people in the camps are Eastern Europeans and prisoners of war. Hitler's empire will always need workers, so the mass extermination of people has slowed slightly. Hitler knows that with an almost unlimited amount of free manpower and resources pouring in from all of his newly acquired territories, he can make any of his sick dreams a reality. Stefan makes his way from camp to camp, careful to interact with as few Nazis as possible. Each time he enters a new area, he tries to remain calm and conduct a thorough search for his family. After days of searching, Stefan feels defeated. He knows he can't give up, but the pain and suffering he's witnessed is enough to drive him mad. The individuals in each work camp are treated more like animals than people. They're starving and overworked. He'll not give up, but with every camp he enters, he loses a little bit of himself. Stefan is about to call it a day when he sees a young girl with her back to him. She's holding on the fence, looking out across a field. Stefan slowly approaches her. "Anna?" he whispers. The girl turns around, tears streaming down her face. It is his daughter. Stefan resists the urge to wrap his arms around her so he doesn't look suspicious. "Papa?" the girl asks. Stefan's eyes begin to water. "It's me. I'm going to get you out of here, but we have to pretend we don't know each other." His daughter stares at him. She can't believe her father is really there. She squints as she looks at his Nazi uniform. Stefan understands. "It's only a disguise, my love, so that I can find you and your mother." He pauses for a moment to look around. "Anna, where is your mother?" His daughter begins to sob. "They took her," she manages to blurt out. "Mama refused to do any more work for the Nazis. She spat in one of their faces and was taken away. I think they're going to kill her." Stefan's eyes open wide. "Where did they take her?" he asked. His daughter points to the other side of the fence where she's been staring previously. Stefan can just barely make out a group of figures standing in a straight line. Clustered in front of them are several Nazis. They hold their weapons by their side, but it is clear what's about to happen. "Come with me," Stefan tells his daughter. They walk quickly toward a jeep parked outside one of the mess halls. Stefan holds his breath as he looks at the steering wheel. The keys are in the ignition. "Get in the back and cover yourself with a blanket on the seat," he says to Anna. She does as she's told. Once his daughter is safely hidden, Stefan slides into the driver's seat of the jeep and turns the key. The engine roars to life. From inside the mess hall, Stefan can hear plates clatter and voices yelling. The sound of the engine alerts the Nazis that something is wrong. He must get to his wife before she's executed or he and his daughter are captured. Stefan floors the jeep and speeds toward the gate. The crack of gunshots ring out behind him as the Nazis flood out of the mess hall and open fire. The guards at the gate raise their machine guns and shoot at the incoming vehicle. Stefan unholsters the Luger he stole and returns fire. He holds his breath to steady his aim and focuses. His resistance training immediately kicks in. He buries around in the chest of one of the guards and sends the second diving for cover. Stefan pushes the accelerator down so hard he feels as if his foot might go through the floor of the jeep. The vehicle slams through the gate and veers down the dirt road. Stefan turns the wheel hard and steers toward the row of prisoners who are about to be executed in the field. The Nazi guards watch the incoming jeep, unsure of what's going on. Then they see their comrades in pursuit from the work camp. Before they can raise their guns to the jeep, it's upon him. Stefan hits several of the Nazi soldiers as he skids to a stop, sending the men flying through the air. There are now only 2 soldiers remaining. They unleash a barrage of bullets into the side of the jeep. Stefan rolls out onto the ground. He pops up from behind the door and returns fire. He hits one of the Nazis in the stomach. The man falls to the ground. Stefan turns the pistol on the second Nazi and pulls the trigger, but instead of firing, there's only a click. The gun is jammed. Stefan ducks back behind the jeep just as the Nazis open fire again. The bullets ricochet off the metal frame of the vehicle. Stefan crawls to the side of the jeep. He waits for the Nazi to run out of bullets. When the firing ceases, Stefan hears the soldier begin to reload. He sprints out from behind the vehicle and runs straight to the enemy. He tackles the man to the ground, punching him as hard as he can in the face. His fist connects with the Nazi's nose, shattering it and knocking the soldier out. Stefan pants as he regains control of his body and slows his heartbeat. Then he hears a familiar voice. "Stefan, is that you?" He looks up to see his wife. She has a shocked look on her face, but when their eyes meet, she smiles and places a hand gently on his cheek. "I knew you'd come," she says. Stefan stands and embraces her for a moment. The shouts of the Nazi soldiers running toward them breaks the joyful moment and brings them back to reality. "Come on," Stefan says, signaling to the Jeep. Stefan, his wife, and the other prisoners who were to be executed pile into the vehicle. Anna hugs her mother. The Jeep drives away, leaving the Nazis in the dust. Stefan and the escapees have a long way to go to get out of Nazi-controlled Europe, but he's now reunited with his family, and he'll do anything to make sure they get to safety. The Allies are winning in Europe, and the end of the war is finally in sight. Suddenly, though, as British and American forces cross the German border, they come face to face with a 1,000-ton beast. The gunner that first spots one of those behemoths thinks he's seeing an optical illusion. He doesn't survive to figure out he's wrong, as the mechanical monster fires its massive cannon and tears his tank in two. What follows is a bloodbath of epic proportions as titanic Nazi war machines tear through the hordes of Allied troops. This is the 1,000-ton German mega tank, Land Cruiser P-1000 Rata, and there is no stopping it. Luckily, this gigantic tank would never see the light of day. It's scary to imagine what would have happened if Hitler and the Nazis had made it work, but the fact that precious resources were needed elsewhere to defend against Allied forces and the sheer magnitude of the project, the Rata was never built. That being said, the Land Cruiser P-1000 Rata has an incredibly interesting history, especially when you consider how massive the tank was actually supposed to be. It would have been capable of carrying numerous turrets and anti-aircraft guns. Hitler's dream was to make the Rata into a battleship that moved across the land, hence the name Land Cruiser. The main armament was even supposed to come off of an actual battleship, although it would need slight modifications. Being the biggest and heaviest tank ever built came with all sorts of problems, but Hitler was willing to overcome all of them to see this monstrosity of a tank become a reality. It was 1941 when the first ideas for the Land Cruiser P-1000 Rata came about. German researchers were given orders to conduct a survey on Soviet heavy tanks and the best way to fight against them. The company that was in charge of the survey was a munitions and weapons company called Krupp. This project ended up being a source of inspiration for Nazi engineers, as it would end up leading to the Panzer VIII Maus super heavy tank being built. This tank was the precursor to the Rata. The man in charge of the study was Edward Grote, who was the director of Krupp at the time. Grote had previously been a special officer in charge of submarine construction for the Nazi Party. He used his background in naval construction along with the survey conducted on Soviet tanks to come up with the design for the Land Cruiser P-1000 Rata. On June 23, 1942, Edward Grote met with Adolf Hitler and other high-ranking members of the Nazi Party. He was absolutely giddy about the plans for a new superweapon that he held in his hands. He pulled out the concept drawings for the Rata and began spewing out his ideas on how it would work and how it would essentially be a battleship that can move across a war zone, destroying every Allied force in its path. The Land Cruiser would be unstoppable, and the enemy would cower at its greatness. Hitler loved the idea and wanted one built as soon as possible, but as Grote talked more about the tank specifications, other members of the Nazi Party became concerned with the amount of resources that would need to be diverted from the production of other vehicles and weapons to complete the project. But as Grote talked on and on about how powerful the Land Cruiser P-1000 would be, Hitler couldn't help but dream about the look on his enemies' faces as they gazed upon his massive tank. Edward Grote explained that the main cannon would be a 28-centimeter SK-C-34 naval gun turret, which could be taken from a Scharnhorst-class battleship. Originally, this turret had 3 cannons, but one would be removed to improve stability and allow for more munitions to be stored aboard the Rata. It would also reduce the weight of the already incredibly heavy tank by around 50 tons. The main armament would be fitted onto the main body of the tank using a 360-degree track, which would allow it to turn and fire in any direction. It could shoot both armor-piercing rounds or high-explosive rounds. Since these shells were designed for naval warfare, they could pack a serious punch and would obliterate any tanks, buildings, or enemy soldiers they hit. The Land Cruiser's biggest threat didn't come from Allied tanks but from their aircraft. This led to the future designs of the Land Cruiser P-1000 Rata to include a 128mm anti-tank gun, along with 8 20mm Flak 38 anti-aircraft guns on the hull of the tank to deal with airborne attacks. To supplement the main cannons, the tank was also equipped with 2 15mm Mauser MG-151 15 autocannons to fire at ground-based targets. The Land Cruiser P-1000 Rata was so huge that its design also included a vehicle bay that could house 2 BMW R12 motorcycles for scouting missions. Since the Land Cruiser itself would not move very fast, even in the best of terrain, the crew needed to have the ability to scout ahead and see what was coming. Like a naval ship, it would also have an infirmary and self-contained lavatory system on board. The tank would also have bunk rooms for the crew and numerous storage areas for supplies and extra ammunition. Basically, everything the crew would need to live and fight would be on board. The armor across the entire tank would almost be 10 inches thick to protect the humongous investment put into the tank and the crew that was inside. All in all, the armor would weigh around 200 tons. The guns and cannons would add an additional 300 tons to the overall weight of the Rata. Just the shell of the land cruiser would be 500 tons, and that was before adding tracks, engines, ammunition, supplies, and crew. The blueprint showed that the land cruiser would end up being around 128 feet long from the tip of the naval guns to the back of the tank, 36 feet high and 46 feet wide. With all this weight and the enormous size of the tank, Hitler and his advisors had some questions about how the whole thing would actually move. But Edward Grote had an answer for that as well. The Rata would include 6 heavy-duty tracks that would help distribute the weight of the tank evenly. They would each be 4 feet wide and 69 feet long. This would allow the land cruiser to traverse difficult terrain, which would be key if the tank was ever going to make it to battle. A 1,000-ton tank could easily get stuck in muddy or rocky areas, but if the tracks worked according to plan, the land cruiser would be able to roll right over anything that stood in its path. However, a main concern for everyone who saw the initial plans of the Rata was that even with the tracks, the weight of the tank would cause the moving fortress to sink deep into even the most solid ground. Wheels were out of the question, as they would need to be so gigantic the whole vehicle would be unstable. Tracks were needed to cross rivers, ditches, and forested areas because they gave the tank better weight distribution and grip on difficult terrain. The clearance from the ground to the underside of the Rata would be about 6.6 feet. This was hypothesized to be tall enough to allow for it to ford most rivers with ease. Since the land cruiser was so heavy, it couldn't be loaded onto boats, as its weight would sink both vessels. And there were no bridges large or strong enough for the Rata to travel across. This meant that once the tank was in the field, it would need to be able to navigate any terrain it came across on its own. Now that Grote had sold his design to Hitler, who could barely contain his excitement over the idea, he needed to explain how this moving fortress would actually move. Grote and his team believed that 2 MAN V12 Z32 44 24-cylinder marine diesel engines could do the trick. The engines were used to propel U-boats through the oceans, so they would be ideal candidates for the land cruiser. Each engine could produce around 8,400 horsepower. The only problem would be that if one of the engines broke, the land cruiser was pretty much stuck where it was. This would make the land cruiser a sitting duck if Allied forces surrounded it and bombarded the tank from the ground or the air. The other option was to equip the tank with 8 Daimler-Benz MB501 20-cylinder marine diesel engines. Each of these engines could produce around 2,000 horsepower, which would provide a little less power than the MAN engines. However, since there were 8 of them, the tank could probably still move even if 1 or 2 went offline. It doesn't seem a final decision was ever made on what type of engine would be best for this new Wunderwaffe. Both engine options would require enormous amounts of diesel to move the Rata. It's estimated that the tank would go through a gallon of fuel a minute running at full power, which would only move the land cruiser around 25 miles per hour. Considering that Hitler's hopes and dreams hinged on the Rata crushing his enemies across Europe, the tank would require an almost unfathomable amount of diesel to meet his goals. Other tanks and military vehicles were transported long distances by railway, but the Rata was too large to fit through tunnels, and there was no train large enough to carry it. At the time the land cruiser concept was brought to Adolf Hitler, Germany was already having problems with its supply lines. Getting oil out of the Middle East was becoming harder and harder as Italian forces were falling apart, and the British were holding their own in the region. This problem was exacerbated by the United States joining the war. The Nazis desperately needed more oil to keep their war machine running, and if the Rata was ever going to become a reality, it'd need a lot more of this vital resource. The decision was made to invade the Soviet Union to try to gain more resources, not so the land cruiser could be built, but so the Nazis could continue fighting the war. This decision would eventually lead to the Nazis' downfall and the end of the war in Europe. Regardless of the type of engines the tank was fitted with, the exhaust system would have been the same. All engines would be provided with snorkels similar to those used on German U-boats. Their connections between the submarine technology and the land cruiser were clearly Edward Grote using what he already knew and then transferring it to the weapon of his dreams. The snorkels would be constructed in a way that oxygen could still reach the Rata's engines even when the tank was traveling through deeper waters. The last thing the Nazis would want was their 1,000-ton tank stuck in a river with no power as the entire vessel began to fill up with water. One of the reasons Hitler might have been so open to the idea of the land cruiser was because he already loved another giant tank design called the Maus. The original design was created by Ferdinand Porsche, the same gentleman responsible for creating fast sports cars and the people's car, better known as Volkswagens. But the Maus was not a car, it was actually the heaviest fully enclosed tank ever made. It ended up weighing around 200 tons. The Maus was about 33.5 feet long, which was twice as long as the Panzer III tank that had brought the Nazis success throughout the war. The Maus was 12 feet high and had armor thicker than any naval ship at the time. Hitler was adamant that the tank be equipped with a 128mm Pak 44 Krupp Panzerabwehrkanone anti-tank cannon. Later, designs also included a coaxial 75mm gun to the main turret, a 7.92mm MG-34 machine gun atop that turret, and an MG-151 20mm anti-aircraft gun to defend the tank. Hitler's dream was to make the Land Cruiser the big brother to the Maus, which is why it was given the name Ratte. The Panzer VIII Maus had one huge thing going for it that the Ratte didn't though: it was actually built. Only 2 were ever completed, and of the 2, only one of them made it to the battlefield before the end of the war. The Maus and the Ratte would have had very similar problems that made these tanks pretty much useless when it came to fighting in a battle. What were the biggest problems for a 1,000-ton tank? As 1943 progressed, the Nazis just couldn't afford to commit the amount of resources and manpower needed to build the Ratte. Nazi leadership could not justify trying to construct the behemoth of a tank when it would end up being so impractical, even if the Führer wanted it to be a reality. Military strategists examined the Ratte and determined that it could likely have been built, but it would not end up being the dream weapon that Grote and Hitler had imagined. Its 1,000-ton weight meant it would pulverize any roads it drove across. Maybe this wouldn't be a big deal for the Ratte itself, but it would make everyone else's lives miserable. Other Germans who used the roads regularly for supply runs or just to move around the country would have had to travel across the jagged remains of concrete that the Ratte left behind. As mentioned before, the size and weight of the Ratte also meant it wouldn't be able to use bridges or trains, so deploying the tank anywhere quickly wasn't a possibility, which is kind of a problem during wartime. The size of the tank would also make it an easy target for Allied bombers. Even though the Ratte would be equipped with anti-air guns, there just wouldn't be enough firepower to stop multiple bombers from targeting the tank and managing at least a few direct hits during a run. The Ratte's armor was thick, but multiple bombs slamming into the hull at the same time would be enough to at least damage some of its more vital components, such as the engines or the tracks. After about a year of planning and crunching the numbers to see if the Land Cruiser Ratte could somehow be built, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, Albert Speer, finally put an end to the madness. He explained that Nazi Germany was at a crossroads, and they needed to focus their resources on weapons that had already been proven to be effective, such as the Panzer IV. However, the craziest part is that Grote and his team at Krupp had already started designing an even bigger tank. They'd taken the idea for the Ratte and implemented a new weapon system. The idea was if they could build a 1,000-ton tank, then adding another 500 tons to it couldn't be all that hard. The team designed a second Land Cruiser and named it the Monster. Instead of using the 28cm SK-C-34 naval gun turret, the P-1500 would use a more powerful weapon that Krupp had already designed. The Monster would be fitted with a modified version of the heavy Gustav 80cm railway gun. This was another massive weapon that just wasn't practical. It had been used once at the siege of Sevastopol, where it took 4,000 men about 5 weeks to get the gun into firing position. After the heavy Gustav was in position, it required another 500 men to fire it. The siege lasted about a month and the heavy Gustav fired 47 rounds. The problem was that it had worn out its original barrel. The massive cannon needed to be shipped back to the Krupp factory in Germany to be refitted with a new barrel. This would be the only time the heavy Gustav would see battle, as the massive cannon was impractical and abandoned by the Nazi military. It was dismantled and its pieces spread throughout the factory to keep the incoming Soviets from using the Nazis' own gigantic cannon against them. Yet, the planners of the Monster didn't see the heavy Gustav as just a useless cannon. They were convinced that by incorporating the heavy Gustav onto the Land Cruiser P-1500 Monster, all the problems with the original weapon could be solved. It would be more versatile and could travel wherever it was needed without the necessity of train tracks. Obviously, it would be incredibly slow and an easy target, but that didn't seem to concern Nazi engineers when they were designing the Wunderwaffe for the Führer. However, Speer would have none of it. When Hitler was preoccupied with news of his forces being defeated across Europe, Speer canceled all projects related to the Land Cruiser, as well as the construction of any more Maus tanks. Unlike others in the Nazi Party, he wasn't captivated by the dreams of gigantic weapons that may or may not have been practical. He was focused on building tanks and weapons that could possibly turn the war back in the Nazis' favor. Luckily, no matter what Speer did, the Nazis had already made too many mistakes and would not be able to recover. There is one terrifying thought, though, that we want to leave you with. What if Edward Grote had come up with the idea of the Land Cruiser P-1000 Ratte earlier? Could it have affected the outcome of the war? This huge tank would most certainly be a formidable machine to go up against in battle, but perhaps it would have been an even more dangerous psychological impact. The Heavy Gustav was originally supposed to be constructed to aid in the demolition of French fortifications when the Nazis' invasion commenced. However, the Nazis found that capturing France was easier than they anticipated, and the invasion was complete before the Heavy Gustav was in its testing phase. Likewise, World War II had been raging for a few years before the Rata was brought to Hitler's attention, which did not allow enough time for him to ever see this nightmare of a tank become reality. But what if those superweapons had been built before the start of World War II? The date is September 1, 1939. Adolf Hitler did the unthinkable and invaded Poland. The rest of Europe braces for what will inevitably be an all-out war. As reconnaissance planes fly over the borders of Germany, they spot gigantic moving structures from the sky. The crew notes that they didn't even need binoculars to spot these monstrosities, as they were so large that they could be seen from cruising altitude. What the Allied recon pilots have witnessed is a platoon of Landcruiser P-1000 Ratas moving toward the French border. In this unthinkable imaginary scenario, the idea for the Landcruiser was developed right when Hitler came to power, and its construction started almost immediately. The massive tanks are slow-moving, but it seems as if nothing can stand in their way. France quickly falls with minimal casualties to Nazi forces. With the land cruisers on the battlefield, German forces move from town to town and decimate any resistance by rolling the Ratas right into the middle of the fight. Nazi soldiers wait patiently in the bellies of the beasts until the battle is over, and then enter French towns and cities to round up anyone who's left alive. Germany begins fighting land battles as if they were naval battles. They deploy their land cruisers across Europe with panzer tanks as support. When Allied forces try to reach the mainland on D-Day, they're greeted by a land cruiser P-1000 Rata on the beach of Normandy. Their bullets do nothing to its thick armor, and the main cannons are able to fire at the ships that sit offshore, causing them to retreat. In the Soviet Union, the Rata platoons are slowly making progress through the harsh Russian landscape. Luckily for the Nazis, the moving fortresses keep them warm during the brutal Soviet winters. They've begun capturing oil wells as they progress deeper into Soviet territory to keep the diesel engines running. It's not a pleasant experience living for months inside of a Rata, but it is doable. As the winter gives way to spring, the land cruisers move forward and capture more land. By having dozens of land cruiser P-1000 Ratas at their disposal, the Nazis have been able to establish footholds in the region that they would have not been able to otherwise. Once a land cruiser is deployed and is set up in a defensive position, it's almost impossible to destroy. As Allied forces focus on trying to eliminate these huge deadly targets, the German Air Force and infantry launch counteroffensives. In a worst-case scenario, the land cruiser P-1000 Rata would serve as a powerful distraction. With Allied forces tied up trying to destroy these monstrous tanks, the Nazis can devote more forces to secure resources and fuel for their war machine. The Allies are focusing too heavily on trying to build their own gigantic tanks or finding ways to defeat the Nazi land cruisers, and they leave themselves vulnerable. Nazi aircraft and soldiers invade Allied countries while their attention is focused elsewhere. The Nazis now control all of Europe, and World War II ends much differently. This scenario could also go a very different way if Germany started building dozens of land cruiser P-1000 Ratas before World War II. The Nazis pour resources into the land cruisers only to find they break down constantly and get stuck every few miles. In this case, World War II might have come to a quicker end, as the Nazis would have depleted their resources early on by building completely useless 1,000-ton tanks. There's no denying that if the Nazis had been able to build a land cruiser, it would have taken a psychological toll on any Allied soldier who looked upon it. The 1,000-ton tank would have been a terrifying sight to behold. If one of those fortresses was able to move across Europe, the Allies likely would have devoted huge amounts of men and resources to try to stop it. If nothing else, the Rata would be able to cause massive amounts of destruction and fear until Allied forces dealt with it or it broke down under its own weight. There are some historians who believe that the design for the land cruiser Rata didn't even make it to Hitler's office. Most think that he asked for a feasibility study for a 1,000-ton tank in 1942, but the design for the Rata is just a fabrication. It could have been a hoax or an engineer's dream tank that he concocted for his own amusement. Currently, there can be arguments made for both sides. Adolf Hitler was a nutjob who most definitely wanted a 1,000-ton tank, but it's not clear how far the plans actually got. Edward Grote and the Krupp Company built some pretty insane vehicles and weapons. We also know there were a number of other Wunderwaffe that Hitler planned on building once he secured the resources to do so. It seems likely he would have wanted the land cruiser P-1000 Rata to be one of them. Right now, we can only speculate on how a massive land cruiser would have affected the outcome of World War II. Maybe the Rata would have turned the tide of the war back in Germany's favor, or perhaps if the tank was built, it would have caused so much destruction to the roads as it drove across Nazi infrastructure that it would have had to expedite their downfall. Either way, the thought of a 1,000-ton tank in the hands of Adolf Hitler is a terrifying one. Polish coast, 1950. The small group huddled amongst the rocks, only 15 feet from the breaking waves. The night air was cool, but thankfully not truly cold yet, as it would soon turn come winter. That would make the rowing easier. Andre carefully scanned the beach, but the coast seemed clear. The war may have ended 2 years ago, but the young Polish resistance fighter was still fighting against the Nazi occupiers. It was a hopeless battle. Hitler's armies had conquered the whole of Europe and were now pacifying the occupied Russian territories. There was no hope of freedom, but if not for himself, then maybe for others. He and his fellow resistance members had changed tracks from removing the Nazis to helping others escape them, namely Jews, Roma, and other minorities who were being rounded up by the millions and sent straight to their deaths in extermination camps across the continent. Andre gave a low whistle. A moment later, there was a return whistle. That was the signal all was clear from the team that was watching for German patrols. He nodded reassuringly to the 4 women and 5 children with him, as well as his 2 partners in arms. They only helped children and women escape the Nazis' grip. It was the men's duty to stay and fight. Following his cue, the group stood and began moving in a running crouch to the shoreline. They crossed the distance quickly and began to dig at the sand dune. The dune was actually 2 small boats that had been covered in burlap. To anyone who wasn't intimately familiar with the area, however, it just looked like another one of the beach's sand dunes. Andre tossed the burlap aside, revealing the boats, but something wasn't right. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, making it hard to see, so he used his hands instead. As he felt along the side of the boat, his hands moved across the strange shadows on the bottom of the boat. Bullet holes. Andre's cry of alarm was drowned out by the sharp sound of German whistles, the type their patrolmen and some policemen used to alert each other. A dozen flashlights came to life from the direction of where the resistance overwatch was supposed to be. It was a trap. He could just barely see through the glare of the lights a figure he recognized as Philip. Philip had been the one to give the all-clear signal, and now he had a gun to his head. The Germans only took prisoners so they could torture them, and the civilians he was escorting, well, they were dead either way. With the war, Andre unslung his submachine gun and began to fire at the rushing flashlights. He screamed at the women and children to get behind the boats, but then more flashlights lit up from behind them. It was a well-executed trap. Bullets roared back at Andre and his group in an angry fury, finding many members of his group. The muzzle flashes gave him something to aim at, though, and Andre turned his hatred on those unseen shooters, quickly expending 1 magazine, then another. He began to reload a 3rd when he was shaken out of rage by David's voice. 15 years his senior, he fought in the short war to resist the Nazi and Soviet invasion before joining the resistance. Andre held him in the highest of esteem. "Andre, go! It's too late! Swim! Go!" David was vigorously gesturing at the lights of the ship out in the open water. Andre was stunned. Go? Leave them behind? What about the women and children? But the figures where they had been huddling between the 2 boats all lay still. "I can't, David, I can't just go." "Go, you fool. We're all dead on this beach. Go and live. Find another way to fight." Andre's legs were lead. He felt like a coward. David punched him hard in the arm, practically pushing him toward the surf. "Go, you idiot." Andre went. He rushed to the breaking waves as David unleashed a hail of gunfire to keep the German heads down. Before Andre dove beneath the waves, though, he heard the distinct sound of David's Błyskawica submachine gun go abruptly silent. He felt the impact of the bullets in the water around him, accompanied by a high-pitched shriek as they went from faster than the speed of sound to a standstill in just a few feet. Andre dove until he hit the bottom, and then he furiously pumped his arms and legs as he fought the surf trying to push him back to the beach. In school, he'd been an excellent swimmer, and motivated by the gunfire of 24 furious Germans, he made it out to the surf line before surfacing for a desperate breath of air. As his head broke the water, he could hear the Germans still shooting, but they had no idea where he was amongst the tossing waves. Filling his lungs, he dove under and started kicking out to sea again. A few hundred feet offshore was an American destroyer accompanying a group of American merchant vessels. Ostensibly, the U.S. naval presence was to safeguard American shipping to Europe in waters it called potentially hazardous due to neutral shipping, despite the war being officially over for 2 years. In reality, it was a show of force by the U.S. After the fall of Britain, it was now the world's premier naval power, and it wanted Germany to remember that, should it get any ideas about crossing the Atlantic. Andre swam fast, and he could see the searchlights coming to life on the American destroyer. Crews scanned the water and the shore, both alerted to trouble by the German shooting. In little time, Andre was found and locked in the gaze of one of the big spotlights. The other 2 spotlights on the ship were aimed directly at the shore. The American sailors were blinding the Germans so they couldn't shoot in Andre's direction. The United States had remained neutral during the war despite the pleas of Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Agreements with the German Reich forbade it from loading political refugees from Reich territory onto its ships, but rescuing sailors in distress was part of international maritime law. Thus, U.S. ships routinely sailed near German-controlled coasts, meeting small boats full of refugees and helping them on board. The Reich launched protest after protest, but the U.S. considered these refugees to be sailors in distress and deferred German diplomats to international maritime treaties. A line with a flotation ring was thrown out at André, and he clung to it gratefully. He was nearly at the point of fatal exhaustion and couldn't pull himself up the rope to the deck. Instead, the sailors gestured and did their best in broken Polish to encourage him to slip the ring over his head and under his armpits. Working together, a team of sailors dragged André on board. He was immediately greeted with a warm blanket, and a few minutes later a hot cup of coffee. He was safe, on his way to America, but everyone else was dead. Manchester, English federally administered zone, pacified territories. Gerald impatiently waited his turn at the Reich's Cultural Affairs Office. In the last year, the Nazis had set to stabilize England and gotten on with the process of direct administration. It felt strange to him. Just a few years ago, this was the Kingdom of Great Britain, the most powerful empire in the world, with direct control over 25% of the world's economic activity. Now, it was just another piece of the Reich's territory, nominally independent, but in truth directly under the control of Berlin via proxy leaders. Perhaps most surprising is how most of the population simply went along with it. The Reichsmark had now almost fully replaced the pound as the German installed exchanges across the Isles. Sighing to himself, Gerald accepted that most people simply wanted to move on. Sure, there were still groups of rebels out there in the hills and forests, but the truth was Britain was beat through and through. The Americans refused to come to their aid this time, and even cut off their Lend-Lease program after the German protests. Britain had stood alone, cut off from its vital trade routes with overseas colonies by German U-boats, who choked the island nation off and starved it into submission. The RAF had fought bravely in the skies, but with no American oil supplies, the Luftwaffe eventually overwhelmed it. The entire countryside still bore the scars of German bombers and the subsequent fighting that raged after the invasion. Gerald's business had been one of the many destroyed in the fighting, and in exchange for government grants to get himself back on his feet, he was here at the Reich's Cultural Affairs Office along with dozens of his countrymen. It was illegal to operate or start a new business within the Reich without a license from a local administrator, and the process inevitably involved a trip to the Cultural Affairs Office. Soon, he heard, it would be mandatory for every citizen. But for now, the Reich's bureaucracy was overstretched with reconstruction. At last, it was his turn to enter one of the 5 interview offices. The man seated behind the desk was unmistakably German, not a British collaborator, but still greeted him with a polite smile. Gerald wished he was looking at that smile from down the iron sights of his Lee Enfield. "Welcome, Mr." The bureaucrat looked over at Gerald's file briefly. "Gerald Adamson, I see you're here to complete your application for federal assistance." Gerald nodded. The bureaucrat's English was pretty good, with only the slightest hints of a German accent. He wondered if he'd been trained for his job back home or if he had been one of the thousands of spies and infiltrators who had sabotaged Britain from within during the war. "Excellent. We're eager to see your business restored and once more profitable." He didn't doubt the German was being honest here. The Reich liked efficiency and productivity. For all its evils, it was a very well-organized institution and pretty good about bringing order to the post-war chaos. "And I believe you brought your genealogy records, marriage license?" "My wife is dead, killed in the bombings." The German blanched for a second. Maybe he was human after all. "Ah, yeah, very unfortunate, Mr. Adamson. You have my condolences. I'm grateful that the unpleasantness is behind us now and we can turn to the task of rebuilding together." Rebuilding together, that was the Reich's favorite slogan, plastered all over the occupied territories it held. Every week, it seemed the Nazis' propaganda ministry churned out dozens of new posters, films, and slogans, but rebuilding together was a classic that never really went away. The bureaucrat had clearly been trained to use this phrase as often as possible. Yet, Gerald thought he detected a very real moment of sympathy when he'd offered his condolences. He took the man in for a moment. He was young, maybe young enough to have been in school during the fighting and recently graduated. After the brief silence, the bureaucrat continued. "Your current records will suffice, Mr. Adamson. A moment, please." The man went to work poring over the assembled paperwork Gerald had presented him. It was common business documents, tax records, insurance statements, but also documents personal to Gerald himself. Genealogy and family records, old wedding licenses, birth certificates. The Reich called it proof of culture, but everyone knew what it really meant. Just like everyone knew what happened to those individuals of unsuitable cultural background. Officially, the Germans were only deporting these people, but Gerald had been privy to intelligence reports during the war. He was pretty sure they hadn't shut down their extermination camps. Unofficially, he was pretty sure those camps were busier than ever. He ought to have been nervous. Who knew what the German Reich would consider unacceptable to their fanatical desire for pure bloodlines? But truthfully, he felt very little anymore. He'd faced death too many times on the battlefield only to end up surrendering to an enemy who was evil incarnate. The same enemy represented by this boyish bureaucrat in a smart suit, whom had shown real regret at the news of his wife's death. The more Gerald thought about it, the more he was sure the kid really was young enough to have spent the war in school. Shame, he thought to himself. Wasn't his fault, not really. But how many innocent British kids had been caught up in the crossfire of a war they hadn't started? Mr. Adamson, all looks in order, and I believe we can approve. But the kid never got a chance to finish his sentence as Gerald whipped his service revolver up and right into his face. One trigger pull later, and Gerald's application for federal aid was over. Gerald sat down heavily on his chair as the officers around him erupted with panicked screaming. He looked at the big clock on the wall in front of him, wondering if the Germans' reputation for precision and timeliness had taken hold even here, in the occupied ruins of Manchester. Exactly 3 seconds later, as the clock ticked 2:35 precisely, the dynamite bundle in his attaché case exploded. Votkinsk, Southern Ural Special Administrative Zone. Absolutely not. There's no manpower. Karsten Stengel, administrator of the Southern Ural Special Administrative Zone, slammed his fist on the table to punctuate his point. The sudden gesture surprised the normally unflappable Schutzstaffel commander. Quickly recovering his composure, Standartenführer Grossmann narrowed his eyes at the man who is technically his civilian superior. Need I remind you that orders to expend all efforts possible in the advancement of the Führer's cultural advancement programs come from the Führer directly? This question was more of a statement, or better yet, a sharpened dagger held at Stengel's throat. But while the good colonel might have gotten his way back in Berlin with such threats and bravado, it wasn't worth a damn out here in the Reich's frontier. Facts were facts, and the fact of the current matter is that there was simply not enough manpower. My dear Standartenführer, you're more than welcome to lend your men to assist in the pacification efforts. I'm sure the Wehrmacht would appreciate the help of such elite soldiers. The SS colonel's face went red with barely restrained rage. For a moment, Stengel thought he might unholster the pistol at his side. For his part, Stengel struggled mightily to hide the tiny smile that stubbornly crept into the corner of his mouth. Everyone in the Wehrmacht considered the SS mostly a joke. Pretty boys with fancy uniforms. It had been the army that had broken the French and English, and it had been the army who, after crossing the Channel and subduing England, turned on the Soviet Union. While the fighting was at its fiercest, the SS had busied itself murdering POWs and civilians who couldn't put up a fight. The entire organization disgusted Stengel, and so did its cultural advancement programs. Many in the army felt the same way. If Stengel gave the orders for Wehrmacht soldiers to assist the SS in rounding up communist Jews and God knows who else they had a problem with, he was pretty certain things wouldn't go the way the Standartenführer Grossmann hoped. The southern Urals were far from the stable occupied territories of Europe and rife with partisans. The loss of an entire SS detachment wouldn't be entirely unlikely. The Standartenführer stood stiff as a board. Very well, Administrator Stengel. I will inform Berlin of the delays and your choice to not alleviate those delays. Stengel waved the SS man away and out of his office. Even if he could spare the manpower, which, with partisan activity rife throughout the Urals, he couldn't, he still wouldn't have done so. He knew where the SS prisoners went, and he wanted no part of it. Besides, other than putting him directly in one of the SS's camps, there was little more Berlin could do to punish him than make him an administrator of freezing territory in the former Soviet Union that practically swarmed with partisans. Damn communists didn't know they'd been beat. If only they'd reached Moscow sooner during the war, lamented Stengel. They might have captured Stalin. Instead, that bastard fled to the other side of the Urals, and the Reich, well, gave up wasn't the right term. Decided it wasn't economical to pursue into the worthless eastern stretches of Russia was more accurate. The Reich had all the important economic and industrial centers as well as the rich oil fields of southern Russia. Anything east of the Urals was frankly not worth the money or manpower to take from the surviving Soviet Union. With a sigh, Stengel turned back to reading the latest casualty and material loss reports from the never-ending peacekeeping operations against the communist partisans. The issue of the SS camps nagged at his conscience, though. They'd grown in number out here in the east over the last few years, and even more were being built to process the vast population of the occupied Russian territories. He grabbed another stack of reports, this time from his urban development supervisor. Chief amongst many of his concerns was the issue of unpopulated homes, which grew by the day. Entire population centers were becoming ghost towns. Wild animals were spreading into cities and bringing disease with them, an issue for the future German colonists, not to mention they'd be moving into cities falling apart around them from a lack of basic maintenance, a serious potential safety hazard and health hazard. His supervisor's recommendation was that vacated quarters simply be demolished. Future colonists would have to build from scratch. Berlin would be very unhappy about that. Northwest Saudi Arabia neutral zone. 32,000 feet. The roar of the B-36's engines was deafening, requiring the use of headsets for the crew to communicate. Captain Jonathan Frakes had to push up against his ear to hear his bombardier clearly. He'd already swapped his headset for a backup, but the issue persisted. Must be an issue with the actual connector then. He caught his co-pilot eyeing the horizon warily, and he couldn't blame him. They both served in the Pacific together during the war against Japan and gotten into a habit of keeping a sharp eye out for enemy fighters. Despite receiving an absolute wallop from the US Navy, the Japanese still managed to put up a pretty stiff resistance on the home islands. Rather than invade, America had opted to bomb and starve the Japanese into submission by destroying their industrial centers and blockading all Japanese shipping. After 4 years, the Japanese were starving to death and had little to no industry to speak of, prompting them to the negotiation table. Their forces in Manchuria suffered a little better. The Chinese nationalists had easily won over the communists after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and United Nationalist China backed up the might of the U.S. Army and had pummeled Japanese forces cut off from resupply. Perhaps if the U.S. had split its forces between the Pacific and Europe, Japan might have stood a chance. But with a united American military in the Pacific, even Japan's Pearl Harbor surprise did little more than slow the U.S. retaliation by a few months. The big intercontinental bomber had been in flight for 16 hours already, taking off from the U.S. base in China, skirting the Indian border on its flight west, since India was now administered by the German Reich. It had no escort because no fighter aircraft had the range for it, and if push came to shove, the B-36 could climb to a maximum ceiling of 40,000 feet and avoid any German fighter currently operational. Its mission was top secret, and there was a long list of contingency plans to put into effect should the bomber crash and the crew and payload miraculously survive. In fact, the Air Force probably preferred that nothing salvageable survive a crash. His bombardier alerted him. There was now only a few minutes from the drop point. Somewhere out ahead and below him in the desert were German positions, 23,000 German troops threatening to cross into the neutral zone, set up by an agreement between Germany and the US after the end of the war in Europe. Germany had driven a spear deep into former British holdings in the Middle East and then pushed deeper. Hitler's ambitions threatened to place the entirety of the world's greatest stockpile of oil in German hands, and the US had threatened war should it continue south and east. The truce had held, but now German troops were gathering at the edge of the neutral zone. Hitler was either testing the Americans or didn't believe they were serious about intervention. This B-36 was here to prove otherwise. Captain Frakes began to climb altitude. No doubt the Germans had been warned. The US wanted them to have cameras ready and waiting for the show to come. America wanted there to be no doubt amongst any of the Reich's leadership that a continued war in the Middle East would end in disaster for them. With US troops so far from the region, it was difficult to present a credible deterrent, but that's what Captain Frakes' mission was all about. The bomb bay doors opened with a shudder, causing the whole plane to shake as its aerodynamic qualities were compromised. In his headset, he heard the bombardier calling for him to hold course. Hold, 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 deploy, egress. There was the audible thunk of a payload being disengaged from the aircraft, and Frakes didn't need his bombardier to tell him to begin egress. He had seen film footage of what came next and already had the plane in a steep banking turn. He'd been assured there was plenty of time to egress, but he wasn't taking any chances. The plane was already several miles from the drop point when it happened. A bright flash of light, bright enough to compete with the sun, and moments later a supersonic shockwave that rattled and shook the aircraft, but the B-36 powered through it unharmed. The eggheads had been right. Frakes had banked steeply to the left to put distance between himself and the bomb, but flew roughly parallel so the explosion could be filmed by 3 of the gunners. With the bright flash dissipating, he ripped off the special eye protection they'd all been assigned and took in the scene with the naked eye. The explosion was as awe-inspiring as it was terrifying. He'd heard that the US had these back toward the end of the war with the Japanese but never used them. Now he could see why. Besides, with their island completely blockaded, the Japanese were no threat to anyone. Nobody deserved these bombs raining down on their heads, but that's just what the US was threatening to do if Hitler didn't respect Middle East neutrality. Surely the Germans weren't too far behind in developing their own, though. Watching the mushroom cloud growing over the uninhabited desert just 30 miles in front of the German positions, Frakes wondered if he'd fired the opening shot of a brand new war. Adolf Hitler broods in his office. He paces back and forth waiting for the phone to ring. There's been opposition to his power, and all guilty parties must be eliminated. But in order to do this, he needs to betray one of his closest allies and best friends. It's taken him years to get to where he is, and he isn't about to lose it all when victory is so close. People will die in the purge to come, but that is of no consequence to Adolf Hitler. He will secure his position as Führer of Germany. Hitler thinks about the years leading up to his ascent to power. He remembers his old friend Ernst Röhm and how he played a vital role in getting Hitler into the position of Chancellor of Germany. But even though Röhm is a good friend and ally, he will not make it out of the purge. Hitler shakes his head as he knows he must betray his friend. They both played major roles in the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923 to overthrow the German government and put the Nazi Party in control of the country. That coup failed, and like Hitler, Röhm had to go into hiding to escape being arrested or killed. But together, they worked toward a new goal, taking over the German government by political means rather than strictly by force. The Nazi Party was still growing at the time, and Hitler was gaining more and more prominence within the party. Ernst Röhm believed in Hitler and would do anything to help him secure his position in the government. To this end, Röhm helped from the Sturmabteilung, also known as the SA, or brown shirts, due to their uniforms. This was an organization that enforced Nazi Party norms and influenced elections. The SA was one of the main organizations that provided the means for Hitler's rise to power. Yet now, in the final days of June 1934, he will betray not only Röhm but anyone else in the SA who questions him. Adolf Hitler stops thinking about the past and starts focusing on the present. He walks over to the door, opens it, and ushers the men waiting outside into the room. Hitler and his advisors take their seats around a large table. The chamber's filled with Nazi regalia. The swastika flag hangs from the wall. Paintings dedicated to the glory of the Aryan race seem to fill every empty space. "You know why you're here," Hitler says. "The SA has played a major role in getting us to where we are today, but now they are becoming a problem. They have ideas of an even greater revolution, one that will put all of our positions in jeopardy." Hitler looks at one of his advisors and nods. The SA is comprised of around 3 million men and outnumbers the German army. We all remember the oppressive rules imposed on our great country by the Treaty of Versailles. The German military can only consist of 100,000 men, but since the government does not control the SA, they can have as many members as they want. This worked well for us in the past when we were trying to secure prominent seats in the government, but now that I've become chancellor, we need to find a way to get them under control. There are grumbles of agreement from the Nazis sitting around the table. The SA is still loyal to Hitler and the Nazi Party, but they are starting to frighten the elites of the country. The beginnings of a delicate plan have already been put into place to ensure Hitler will become the supreme ruler of Germany when the current president dies. However, this will not happen if the SA incites a revolution before he can make final preparations. Everyone in Hitler's chambers agrees something must be done. The leaders of the SA need to be dealt with. Otherwise, everything they worked so hard to accomplish will fall apart. Thank you for your input, gentlemen. I will take what you've said under advisement and will come up with a solution. I must now meet with members of the SA. I will update you on any progress next time we meet. Adolf Hitler stands up from the table. The other members of the Nazi Party rise and salute him. Chancellor Hitler walks down the hall of the government building and enters a room where members of the SA are waiting. "Gentlemen, we have much to discuss." Hitler takes a seat at the table. "I, along with everyone else in the party, appreciate your support in keeping everyone in line," Hitler says to the SA officials. "Your methods of intimidation have kept the press quiet and squashed my opposition. For that, I'm eternally grateful." He pauses for a moment to make eye contact with the men in the room. "You have all been loyal in your duties, and I know that this revolution is taking slightly longer than anticipated, but we are almost there." Hitler is interrupted by one of the leaders of the SA. "Longer than anticipated? Your use of diplomatic means to achieve our goals is going nowhere. We need to overthrow the entire government and put true leaders in charge like Ernst Röhm." The other SA members in the room nod their heads and cheer in agreement. Hitler looks at the man standing in the corner of the room. It is Heinrich Himmler, his right-hand man. They both know that too much could be lost if they allowed the SA to continue inciting violence and force an armed revolution. "We couldn't agree more," Hitler lies. "But you need to give us time to deal with the elites of the country. It is with them that the loyalty of many lies. When we bring them to our side and they support the Nazi cause, everything else will fall into place." "Screw the elites," one of the SA shouts. "All they do is hide behind their money and servants. It is time for the people to reclaim Germany. We say that the elites should be removed from office and replaced by members of the SA with more fundamental Nazi beliefs. That is what we are going to do," Hitler reassures the SA gathered before him. "But first we need their support. Once my position as Führer is secured, we can move our plans forward and deal with the real threat to our people, the Jews. However, if you don't give me the time I need to change the system from within, there will be backlash from the elites and many other German citizens as well. The German army is still loyal to the president and the current administration. They will not just roll over and hand us the country. Then we will wipe out the army and take the government by force," one of the SA leaders shouts. Hitler shakes his head as he glances at Himmler. "We will take that under advisement. But right now I have another meeting. Thank you for bringing your concerns to my attention. It is much appreciated and they will all be addressed in time." There's murmuring from the SA officials as Hitler leaves the room. "We need to deal with this sooner rather than later," Himmler warns him. "The SA is becoming too powerful, and we're going to have a civil war on our hands if we don't get them under control." "I know that," Hitler hisses back. "I'm trying to figure out the best way to eliminate this threat. We cannot let them overthrow the elites. We need their money and support to realize our final goal. Every time I meet with members of the government and their influential friends, they complain to me about the trouble the SA is causing. They blame me for the destruction. They blame me for the riots. They blame me for the violence. It's getting tiring. I've talked to Rome, and he's working to get his members under control, but he also agrees with the SA ideology. I'm not sure he can be trusted any longer. Then Rome will need to be dealt with as well, Himmler says. The corner of his lip curls up slightly. I'm sure your SS branch of the SA would be happy to help out. We can use them to eliminate our problems from within the organization. After all, what good is having your own personal bodyguards if you don't use them to do your bidding? Hitler stops walking and is silent for a moment. Are you saying what I think you're saying? He asks. Himmler nods his head. Hitler rubs the bridge of his nose as he thinks out loud. I really didn't want it to come to this, but it seems as if we have no other choice. Gather the SS and work with Goebbels to prepare them for their mission. I don't know when we'll need to purge the party, but it'll be one day soon. Himmler salutes Adolf Hitler and marches down the hallways. Hitler calls after him, Heinrich, be discreet. We don't want anyone getting wind of this before we can execute the plan, especially Rome. Himmler nods his head and continues on his way to brief his loyal SS men about the plan to cleanse the Nazi party. Adolf Hitler exits the parliamentary building and enters a car idling on the street. The summer rain falls steadily, casting a gray shadow across the city of Berlin. He has a meeting with several German elites and military leaders that he is not looking forward to. He knows how it'll go. They'll tell him the Nazi party is becoming too aggressive and that the SA must be dealt with. This time though, Hitler has a plan. The SA will soon cause him no more trouble, and the elites of the country will finally be off his back. Hitler enters the room full of generals, politicians, and powerful businessmen. He shakes the rain from his coat and hangs it on a nearby hook. My friends, he begins, I've met with the SA leaders and they are less than willing to back down. Therefore, I have taken matters into my own hands. In the days to come, you will watch the SA fall apart. It's all being taken care of as we speak. One of the military generals speaks up. There are rumors that the SA is forming a people's army. This is unacceptable and will lead to the destruction of the country. The Nazi party is becoming more trouble than they're worth. Hitler represses the rage that fills him. I assure you, General, he clearly says as calmly as possible, it is not the Nazi party that is the problem. It is Rome and the SA. And if you were listening, I just said it is being dealt with. It better be, or you'll find that your position in the government may not be as secure as you might think. We're happy to squash this rebellion and put the country under martial law if you can't do it yourself, responds the general. Do not threaten me, Hitler spits. In the coming days, the SA threat will be crushed. After that, it's only a matter of time until President von Hindenburg passes, and I am fully in control of this country. You do not want to be on my bad side when that happens, General. When I'm Führer, all I will have to do is snap my fingers and you will be removed from your position. There are plenty of loyal followers to take your spot. There's an unsettling silence in the room. I have my top men working on a solution for the problems Rome and the rest of the SA are causing for you. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to make preparations. Hitler turns and exits the room. His wet leather boots squeak down the hallway. In his mind, Hitler is playing out the murder of everyone who has ever questioned his decisions. There will be no escaping his wrath once he has complete control of the country. People will hang, generals will be shot. It's only a matter of time until he gets everything he's ever wanted and makes the world pay dearly for allowing it to happen. Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, Hermann Göring, and Adolf Hitler sit around a table. The room is lit by candlelight as they discuss the plan to purge the Nazi party of anyone who might jeopardize their future plans. We all know that Rome and the other leaders of the SA are not planning to overthrow the government anytime soon. They're unhappy but still have faith in the Chancellor, says Himmler. However, the current ruling body doesn't see it this way, which means we're going to have to make it look like the SA was trying to destabilize the country to ensure the people of Germany are on our side. The other men around the table nod in agreement. Göring chimes in. We've already planted fake evidence in the offices and homes of the people we need to get rid of. We can use this as justification for purging the party. As long as it looks like we're saving the country from chaos, no one will question us. Hitler sits quietly, staring at the burning candle flame in the middle of the table. Rome has been loyal to me this entire time. He's one of the main reasons I am where I am today. But the fact that he is the face of the SA means he must be eliminated. I regret this, but make sure once Rome is killed, there is indisputable evidence that he was connected to an extremist plot to overthrow the government. If that doesn't work, we'll say he has a proclivity toward unbecoming sexual behaviors. As you wish, replies Himmler. Everyone here is aware of Vice Chancellor von Pappen's speech at the University Marburg a few days ago on June 17th, right? Himmler asks the other men around the table. They confirm they know of it. It's for this reason I believe now is the perfect time to carry out the Night of the Long Knives. We can use that speech as an example of how radicalized the SA have become. This, along with all the planted evidence, will be enough to execute everyone we need to ensure the elites and army stay on our side while maintaining the loyalty of the more moderate Braunschweig members. I agree, says Hitler. By keeping the current governing body and military happy as well as retaining most of the SA, we will have an armed force large enough to begin our plans of rearmament and military expansion. Once this is done, we can move into the next phase of our final solution and begin ridding Germany of the Jewish threat. "We will return this country to its former glory, and no one will stop us." Hitler slams his fist down on the table. The Nazis in the room applaud his conviction. A few days go by without incident. Then, unexpectedly, the timetable for the purge gets moved up. "What do you mean the brown shirts are rebelling in the streets?" Hitler screams into a telephone receiver. Himmler's on the line. "Put an end to it. I'm coming to Munich now." Hitler slams down the phone and grabs his coat. His car is summoned to drive him to the airport. It's June 30th, 1934, when Hitler lands in Munich. Top Nazi officials wait for him on the tarmac. "Give me an update. What's going on?" He begins walking to the waiting caravan of cars as his entourage follows. Himmler speaks first. "The SS have been deployed and are subduing the SA brown shirts who are rioting. We've also deployed men to arrest anyone who is sympathizing with the SA or trying to cause problems for the party. They've been told that if anyone resists arrest, they are to be shot." "Good," Hitler responds. "Sir, you should know that the brown shirts who are rioting through Munich are calling for your resignation and accusing you of treachery," Göring says. "We'll have them all executed for treason." "Very good," Hitler replies. The men enter the cars waiting for them and begin to drive toward Munich, where they'll meet the SS forces. "Contact Rome and tell him to gather the heads of the SA for a meeting. Make it seem like we just want to talk. Inform him that they should all meet at Hanselbauer Hotel in Bad Wiessee. We'll deal with them there." "Yes, sir," says Göring. Hitler and his men proceed to the Bavarian Interior Ministry. When they get there, August Schneidhuber, the chief of the Munich police, is nervously waiting for them. Hitler bursts into the room screaming about the ineffectiveness of the Munich police. He walks up to Schneidhuber and rips the epaulettes showing his rank off the chief's uniform. "How dare you let the brown shirts wreak havoc in the city? We're so close to a unified and powerful Germany, yet you let something like this happen." "I'm sorry, Chancellor," the chief of police says. "No, you aren't, but you will be," screams Hitler. "Take him outside and shoot him." SS soldiers grab Schneidhuber by the arms and escort him out of the building. A few moments later, the sound of a gunshot is heard from outside. "Now it's time to deal with the brown shirts once and for all," Hitler says as he exits the room. Hitler and his men head to the Hanselbauer Hotel, where Rome and the other SA leaders are staying. They had gone to bed the previous night when Hitler had not yet arrived. The sun is just starting to rise as the SS pulls up to the hotel in their vehicles. It's a caravan of men loyal to Hitler. There's no escaping what's to come. The soldiers burst into the hotel with their guns raised. The concierge throws his hands in the air and begs for mercy. The SS run from room to room, kicking the doors of the SA leadership while they're fast asleep. Hitler's enemies are dragged from their beds, lined up in the lobby. They stand in their pajamas, terrified of what's to come. Urine runs down the legs of men who knows that this will be the last moments on the planet. Hitler enters the Hanselbauer and looks upon the faces of the confused SA leaders with disgust. "You thought you could get away with it," Hitler shouts at them. "Well, we uncovered your plot to overthrow the government and the Nazi party. This ends now. You're all under arrest and will be tried for treason." Hitler scans the faces of the men who stand before him in their nightgowns. There are some that would betray him, but most are loyal. "Who's this?" Hitler says, pointing to a young man standing next to an SA leader named Edmund Heinz. "We found them in bed together," one of the SS soldiers informs him. "Take them outside and shoot them both," Hitler says with disgust in his eyes. "We'll publicize this and make sure everyone in Germany knows that laying with another man is punishable by death, no matter who you are." Hitler signals to his soldiers to take the SA leaders away. They're headed to Munich's Stadelheim prison, where they'll be questioned, tortured, and eventually executed. Before Ernst Röhm is escorted out of the hotel, Hitler walks up to him and grabs his arm. "I'm sorry, old friend," he whispers into Röhm's ear, "but I have to do what's best for the party and the country. I'm sure you understand." Röhm says nothing. He keeps his head down and follows the others out the door. His friend and the man he believed would return Germany to its former greatness has betrayed him. Hitler stands in the lobby of the Hanselbauer Hotel, watching his longtime friend being led to his death. One of the SS soldiers walks up to the Chancellor. "Sir, everything's ready at the party headquarters. There's a crowd assembled to hear you speak." "Thank you. Let's get going," Hitler says. He's driven back to Munich, where he gets himself ready to speak to the masses. He walks up to the podium and with a fit of rage begins screaming into the microphone. His voice echoes off the buildings in the vicinity. Hitler explains how his SS uncovered a plot by the brown shirts to overthrow the government and send the country to civil war. Ernst Röhm and the other SA leaders have committed the worst treachery in the world history, he screams into the microphone. His SS guard closely watches the crowd to gauge their reactions and to make sure no one does anything rash. Anyone who consorts with the undisciplined and disobedient characters of the SA will be put to death, Hitler concludes. The crowd erupts in applause. There are regular citizens, Nazi party members, and even sympathetic SA in the crowd. Hitler has won them all over. The threat that the SA posed to his rule has come to an end. Joseph Goebbels watches the future Führer's speech from the side of the stage. He claps as the crowd shows their support for Adolf Hitler. Goebbels turns and walks into the Nazi party building. He picks up the phone and is transferred to Hermann Göring. "Colibri," Goebbels says into the receiver and hangs up the phone. On the other side, Göring smiles. He places the phone back in its cradle and gives the order for the SS soldiers to execute any remaining SA sympathizers. Dozens are killed by the SS across Germany. After his speech, Hitler orders SS commander Sepp Dietrich to execute the SA leaders at Stadelheim prison. Most of the SA members rounded up at the Hanselbauer Hotel are put to death by firing squad. Others are saved only to be put on trial for treason. Each trial lasts minutes before the SA leaders are convicted and shot. Hitler's Purge and the Night of the Long Knives ends on July 2, 1934. During the Purge, the SS executed Ernst Röhm, Reichswehr General Kurt von Schleicher, Hitler's predecessor as Reich Chancellor, and his wife, Major General Ferdinand von Bredow, Schleicher's friend and collaborator, Gustav von Kahr, the Bavarian chief of state who had condemned the beer hall putsch and Hitler's role in it, and Gregor Strasser, a Nazi leader who tried to reach an agreement with the previous Chancellor von Schleicher to keep Hitler from rising to power. More than 1,100 people were brought into custody and around 100 individuals were killed during the Night of the Long Knives. Hitler sits in his office with a smile on his face. He's rid the country of his enemies and it's only a matter of time before he becomes the Führer. President von Hindenburg is getting sicker and sicker by the day. Hitler rewards the SS forces for their loyalty by making them a completely independent entity from the SA. Slowly but surely, the SS takes control of the police forces across the country. Eventually, Heinrich Himmler centralizes all of the SS under his command. This streamlines decisions being made and makes the SS the legal authority throughout Germany. Any resistance or disruption to Hitler or his plans are now quickly dealt with by the SS. There's no more freedom of speech or expression. Any opposition to the Nazi Party is swiftly punished. The murders that were committed during the Night of Long Knives are all but forgotten. The Reich cabinet legalizes the actions taken during the Purge by the SS as an emergency measure to ensure the security of the country. Hitler claims that since it was all done to protect the nation of Germany, any violence committed against the SA was warranted and therefore legal. This sets a precedent for the genocide he's about to launch against the Jewish people. If it is legal for the Nazis to kill anyone who threatens the state, then all Hitler has to do is convince German citizens that the Jewish people are trying to overthrow the government and control the economy. Once the German people are convinced of this, they'll have no choice but to support the genocide of the Jews. This is an easy sell for most at the time, as they have been force-fed Nazi propaganda for several years now. On August 2, 1934, President von Hindenburg dies. Soon after, Adolf Hitler proclaims himself the Führer of the nation and gives himself absolute power. This change in power becomes official on August 19, 1934. Because of what he did to the SA leadership, Hitler now has the full support of the German military as well as the SS Guard. Since his main opposition to becoming supreme ruler of Germany was destroyed a month prior during the Night of Long Knives, there is no one to stop him. Hitler gains more and more power. He uses his SS soldiers to carry out his bidding. No one who opposes Adolf Hitler is safe any longer. His purge has been complete, and the only thing left for him to do is build up Germany's military and prepare for war. Hitler's desire to reclaim former territories of the German Empire and eventually expand his influence across the world is coming to fruition. In the years to come, the world will be plunged into war as Adolf Hitler tries to purge it of the Jewish people and basic human rights. Luckily, the Allied powers will be there to stop him, but not before millions of innocent lives are lost. The end of World War II is fast approaching. Going out of his mind with stress, Adolf Hitler marches up and down his bunker underneath Berlin. He's acutely aware that he's not getting out of this alive. Above ground, Russian bombs blast Berlin as Nazi child soldiers throw down their arms and cry for their mothers. Women scream as merciless Red Army soldiers pull them out of their houses. Hitler won't let himself be paraded through the streets to be beaten and spat at and hanged from a rope. He has a plan that will ensure that this does not happen. And as he contemplates his grim end to his life, the definitive failure of his wretched ambitions, he has one more thing on his mind: the loot. Insane amounts of money, gold, art, jewels, and furniture. It all has to be hidden. The Nazis have a fortune of unimaginable proportions. They don't want to give that up, so they'll hide it where no one will ever find it. This boundless treasure, taken in such endlessly harrowing circumstances, will be hunted for a long time to come. Today, we'll touch on this Nazi fortune and the many treasure hunters who have spent years trying to find it. But first, I want to tell you about the sponsor of today's video, Morning Brew. Nothing is worse than starting your day by endlessly scrolling through news and social media apps, hoping to find something relevant to you. And when you do find something that sounds interesting, the actual story is often dry, dense, and boring. Believe me, I had the same problem, and it was starting each and every day off on the wrong foot. And that's why I now begin each day with Morning Brew. Morning Brew is the free daily newsletter that's really the absolute best way to start your day. It'll get you up to speed on everything you need to know in minutes, with business, finance, and tech stories that actually respect your time and get you the info you want quick. Want to find out the real reason why a random company is suddenly the latest meme stock? Or learn what types of content TikTok finally decided to ban from their platform? Or maybe you want to impress your friends with in-depth knowledge about how Lego became a multimedia powerhouse. It's only a 5-minute read. But to get it, you'll have to sign up for Morning Brew yourself. It's completely free and takes less than 15 seconds, so do yourself a favor and become smarter in just 5 minutes every day by signing up for Morning Brew at morningbrewdaily.com/infographics. Or click the link in the description. When the Nazis invaded a nation, the first thing they would do is usually head to the central bank. They wanted the gold. They wanted hard cash. They wanted everything of value. The invaded country knew this was going to happen, of course, so they'd usually try to get as much gold as possible out of the country. Sometimes it went to New York Federal Reserve in Manhattan before ending up in Fort Knox. But that didn't always happen. On March 12, 1938, the German Wehrmacht marched into Vienna, Austria. Soon, a businessman and friend of Hitler, Wilhelm Kepler, arrived at the Austrian Central Bank. At his side were armed men. They ordered the bank to hand over about 100 tons of gold. They knew that Austria had already sent 5.7 tons of gold to England, where they thought it would be safe. Kepler told them to bring it all back. He said it's now the property of the Nazi Party. This was just one case, one country. Wherever the Nazis landed, they looted with abandon. We can't say for sure how much gold Germany stole during the war, but some say it was at least $20 billion worth in today's money. Some sources have it in the hundreds of billions. On top of what they took from banks was the gold, houses, and other belongings they stole from the Jewish people during the Holocaust. There were also the artworks. Lots and lots of very valuable artwork. Wherever the Nazis went, they stole the art. Hitler hated a lot of modern art. He called it degenerate. That might have had something to do with the fact that he himself was a failed artist. But for someone with such an unartistic outlook on life, he wasn't actually that bad, or at least in terms of the basics. You can see what was going on in his mind when you look at this painting of Jesus and the Virgin Mary. His blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus doesn't really look like someone from the Middle East who spent a long time under a hot sun. He looks more like a baby version of one of the Hanson brothers. Hitler wasn't someone who could appreciate an art form such as Cubism or Expressionism, but the Nazis, and especially the Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, stole a lot of valuable modern art despite what Hitler thought about it. The Nazis also took ritual silver pieces from all the synagogues they plundered. This amounted to a lot of silver. Many of the items were eventually recovered by the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program, aka the Monuments Men. But a hell of a lot of the Nazi plunder was not so easy to find. This included a lot, and we mean a lot, of hard cash, on top of all the gold and silver and hundreds of thousands of valuable cultural items. If we take into account everything the Nazis looted over Western Europe, parts of the Soviet Union, and as far away as Africa, you could say the years-long robbery was the biggest robbery ever. Just take into consideration something like this. In 1943, when the Nazis were in Tunisia, North Africa, they took a load of gold from the Jewish folks on the island of Djerba. As usual, the Nazis intended to send the gold back to Germany, but it may have gone down with a ship on the way. We say may because it's not certain what happened to that gold. As you'll soon see, separating the myth of Nazi gold with the reality of Nazi gold isn't always easy. How much treasure is still out there is hotly debated even today. But we think by now you have a good idea about how much wealth the Nazis had. This is why when the Russians entered Germany at the war's end and the UK, US, and France were soon to be there, one of Adolf Hitler's chief concerns was all that Nazi loot. During the war, much of it was kept in the Reichsbank, the central bank of the German Reich in Berlin. Hitler knew that once the enemy got to Berlin, one of the first things they would do is head to the bank. It was a chief concern of his that he'd lose the gold. In February 1945, the bank was almost destroyed when close to 1,000 B-17 flying fortresses started dropping bombs on Berlin. With these planes, the US dropped around 1.5 million tons of explosives. The Soviets' Red Air Force, as well as the British RAF Bomber Command and the French Air Force, also did their fair share of dropping bombs on Berlin. Berlin had taken a beating for years, but that February attack by the Americans destroyed many major buildings and left many people homeless or worse, dead. There were hundreds of people working in the bank when it was hit. There may not have been any deaths, only because the employees were already in hiding in underground bunkers, and the blasts only destroyed the upper levels of the building. Still, Hitler now knew that it was time to move much of what was in the bank's vaults out of there. For years, those vaults had been getting fat with gold bullion, not to mention thousands and thousands of gold teeth and pieces of gold jewelry that had been taken from Jewish prisoners after they'd killed them in the gas chambers. Many of these pieces were deposited in the bank under a fake name, that of Max Heilinger. Under this name, the Nazis stored not just gold items but also banknotes, arts, and valuable furniture. The gold would later be melted and other things eventually fenced to dealers. We should also say that the Nazis stole from thousands of Poles, Russians, and other Europeans, Romani and Sinti, as well as Jehovah's Witnesses and homosexuals. The Nazis thought this little scheme would make them rich and leave no obvious tracks, but after the bombing of the bank, it was looking like Hitler and the Nazis might lose it all. This is why Hitler ordered some of his commanders to start emptying the vaults. Part of the removal consisted of about 100 tons of gold bullion, worth millions back then, so a fortune in today's money. The removal also included 3,682 bags of German marks, 80 bags of foreign money, 63 bags of silver, some platinum bars, lots of jewelry, artwork, and hundreds of bags of valuables that had been stolen by the Nazi elites. All this was sent to a salt mine in the village of Merkers, about 200 miles from Berlin. This was only part of the Nazi stash, but it was enough to help Hitler breathe a sigh of relief. Not long after Hitler started thinking the loot was safe, Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army was crossing the Rhine. On April 4th, the 3rd Battalion of the 358th Infantry Regiment walked into Merkers unaware of what was stored down in the salt mine. 2 days later, Lieutenant Colonel William A. Russell of the 19th Infantry Division's G5 was outside the mine asking questions. He'd become suspicious after talking to a few people, so he told the German mine bosses he wanted to have a look down the shafts. When a few of his men went down there, they could not believe their eyes. It felt like a dream. In front of them was a good chunk of Germany's gold reserves, millions in paper money of various currencies, as well as art and other valuables kept in trunks and piled up on crates. Many of the obscenely valuable treasure chests were packed into a space of 23 meters and 46 meters down into the ground. Dwight D. Eisenhower inspected the loot for himself and later wrote, "Crammed into suitcases and trunks and other containers was a great amount of gold, silver, plate, and ornament, obviously looted from private dwellings throughout Europe. It's a rough estimate, but the value of everything found would be about $8 billion today. But there was lots more." On April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, he was breathing a little heavier again. He was now in the midst of a nervous breakdown. He could hear artillery shells in the distance. He was having nightmares about being strung up and humiliated by mobs of Soviet soldiers. He also heard that those damned Americans had found his gold. Outside in the streets, German families feared what their fates would be. Children stood on street corners with guns in their hands, their helmets too big for their heads. Elsewhere, certain Nazi leaders were trying to get out of Germany and take their loot with them. Hitler knew he wasn't going anywhere. He'd die in the bunker and make sure that all the documents down there no longer existed when that bunker was found. On April 28th, Hitler and his secretary Eva Braun got married. It wasn't a very jolly affair, to say the least. Hitler didn't look well at all. His skin was ashen white, his fingers constantly trembled. Every time he heard a bomb explode in the distance, a look of anguish crossed his face. When he was informed about how the dead Benito Mussolini had been strung up on meat hooks in Milan's Piazzale Loreto, he looked as though he was going to throw up. He wasn't so bereft that he couldn't have someone take down his final will and testament. In it, he said, "The responsibility of the outbreak of this war cannot rest on me." The blame, he said, rested on international Jewry and its assistants. He also bequeathed his art collection to the town of Linz, and anything else of value, he said, should go to the Nazi Party. Surely, at this point, he might have been thinking about all that loot. One thing's for sure, the Red Army was thinking about it. They pretty much had a field day when they entered Berlin. They committed obscene atrocities against the people, especially the women. They walked into the finest houses, shot anyone who stood in their way, and relieved the families of all their valuables. It would be a massive understatement to say the Soviet Union and its people suffered during the war. So it's not too surprising that an unofficial order was given to soldiers which said, take what you wanted, but things of high value should be taken back to the Soviet Union under what they called a trophy commission. They cleared out museums, libraries, people's private collections, and things they found in the National Archives. It was a free-for-all. Individual soldiers looted houses when they'd done what they felt they had to do with the occupants, but the big stuff was supposed to go back to the Communist Party. They took all artwork that had been created by some of the greats. This included works by Monet, Cézanne, El Greco, Goya, Bruegel, and Van Gogh, Rembrandt, Raphael, and Leonardo. They found incredibly valuable religious artifacts as well as important medieval manuscripts and even some gold treasures of Troy. They'd only admitted to taking the latter in 1994. As you'll see, just how much the Soviets sequestered is up for debate. It's hard to say what it was all worth, but reports state that there were millions of objects that could be worth many billions in today's money. In the minds of the Soviets, they deserved everything they'd taken in light of their suffering during the war. Nonetheless, they were aware that they should have had much more. Where was the rest of the gold? The Nazis said they had more gold than you'd find in the legendary El Dorado. The Soviets only recovered about $3 million in gold from the Reichsbank, but subsequent interrogations revealed that there had been more like $17 million of gold in the bank. It was only then that they discovered that a heist had taken place at the bank in April. This was the work of future war criminal SS Colonel Josef Spaziel, under the orders of his seniors in the SS. Spaziel would later testify against some of his commanders during the Nuremberg trials. That's why he went on to live a normal life after the war. He might have even opened a chain of supermarkets, but that's not certain. Still, it seems he did okay after the war. That could partly be because he was put in charge of taking care of a lot of the Nazi gold as well as various stolen currencies. One thing we should make clear here is that all the gold and cash in the vaults of the Reichsbank was the bank's money, the public's money. No Nazi had the right to waltz in there and empty the vaults. So when Spaziel and his men turned up at the bank on April 22nd, they were armed with machine guns. They ordered the staff to load gold, jewelry, and cash into trucks waiting outside. There's about $146 million in foreign currency alone, although not much gold was taken as it was so heavy. They drove the trucks out of Berlin and later flew to Austria, but what they did with all that money is still a bit of a mystery. This is why some people have said for a long time that the vast majority of Nazi cash and gold has never been accounted for. In the book The Reichsbank Robbery, the author claims that some SS officers made deals with officers in the US military and together they funneled a lot of the money out of Germany. We can't say if this is true, but it makes more sense when you know that many Nazi war criminals were sneaked out of Germany in so-called rat lines, paid for and managed by US intelligence services. After all, the Soviet Union was now the enemy. The US required Nazi informants and expertise. For sure, a lot of Nazi money was laundered through Swiss banks, and there's no doubt some high-ranking Nazis kept a bit of it, but that doesn't account for all of it. There have been plenty of rumors about the whereabouts of the gold and cash, such as some of it ending up on the Auckland Islands, but these sound more like tall stories than facts. Some stories, though, make you think there's a fortune buried somewhere on this earth. Let's now begin part 2 of this story, an investigation into the missing gold and mountains of money. Let's call this section The Hunt for the Nazi Gold. A few years ago, a Polish treasure hunter named Tomasz Jurek told a US journalist there are so many tunnels, who knows what else is there? It's the tip of an underground city. He was referring to a mountainous area of Lower Silesia in southwestern Poland. Before and during the war, this was a part of Germany, and as the war came to an end, many of the Germans living there got out as fast as their feet could carry them. Often that meant walking right into the Red Army's guns. More often than not, they were shot down like vermin. They had no time to think about packing up their valuables. But what's interesting is that when the area was repopulated by Poles, many of them made some rather startling discoveries. The Germans had left surprises for them, treasure, lots and lots of treasure. As the war was coming to an end and the Russians were marching toward Berlin, many wealthy Germans thought Lower Silesia was a safe place to hide their valuables. High-ranking Nazis headed there to hide their loot. But as we said, regular people also just left all their riches behind, sometimes hidden in the ground. A man who was the chief of police during the war, a German military officer named Herbert Kloss, was later interrogated by the Poles. Under duress from the interrogators, he admitted that he'd been asked to store as much silver, gold, and other precious things as possible. He hid the items inside chests, after which the chests were sealed and buried. He told the interrogators the gold was stored at police headquarters. The chests were made of iron and hermetically closed with rubber seals. Also, the chests were unmarked, so nobody would know what was inside. Only many of these chests were buried when he wasn't there. He'd apparently fallen off his horse and was hospitalized for a while, so he didn't know where the chests were. Some people did, and one day they expected to go back and reclaim them. For decades, people have been looking for this bounty of gold. Treasure hunters were and are well aware of this great big stash that the Americans had found down in the mine. They know what you have found out today, namely that somewhere there is a fortune to be found. These people have looked in earnest. They haven't been compelled to dig for a lifetime by some ancient myth. There is missing money, missing gold, missing art. It's just a matter of time before someone finds it. How it was distributed between the Nazi leaders at the end of the war remains a mystery. Many Nazi leaders died, many were executed, many more went on to live mysterious lives on the run. The Americans helped some while they lived under alias in South America and other countries. To this day, there are treasure hunters who believe that much of that gold is underground in a series of giant tunnels. They say some of it is stored on a train that's gotten the name the Nazi Gold Train. It all sounds like something out of the movie franchise Indiana Jones, but people take this seriously. Some people believe that on that buried train, there are 300 tons of gold, a cornucopia of precious jewels, expensive weapons, and also quite a few priceless artistic masterpieces. Historians say this train might not have even existed, but by God have people looked for it over the years. As the New Yorker wrote in 2016, treasure hunters believe there is a labyrinthian complex that may hold many Nazi treasures. That amounts to something like an underground city. In that article, the journalist wrote that he was met by a Polish geophysicist from the Polish Academy of Sciences and was taken to a German-dug tunnel that was 16 feet high and 18 feet wide, and big enough for a Greyhound bus to drive down. The journalist asked what exactly were the Nazis building here. The scientist replied, "That's the mystery." Were they building a subterranean city that would store all their valuables and money? Were they intending to build superweapons down there, or were the tunnels just a place to hide for Nazi leaders? At the end of the war, the Germans closed most of those giant tunnels off. Although most of them were a work in progress, some of them were almost done. 11% of them were reinforced with concrete and others had just been started. Millions of work hours had been put into building the tunnels. They were incredibly hard to engineer and harder to excavate, but Hitler was adamant that they had to be done. Why? No one really knows. It was only when the war ended that the Poles would be walking around near the mountains and discover a railway track that seemed to end for no good reason. Sometimes they'd find a hole that led to a shaft. Sometimes they'd be strolling through the forest and discover they'd just walked over a ventilation shaft. The Nazis had been very busy bees indeed. We should point out that the labor involved in the underground city construction had been done by many thousands of enslaved people whose lives often ended with a shovel in their hand. Some of them were worked to death and others died from disease and malnutrition. It's thought that about 5,000 prisoners died working in the tunnels. Documents show that some were sent back to Auschwitz concentration camp. One document states that 14 tunnel workers were executed after trying to escape. As much as treasure hunters have dug and have spent their entire lives exploring such tunnels and looking for new ones, no one has yet come across a major stash of treasure. Some valuable items have been found, but not the billions they believe are missing. The story gets even more interesting when you hear what a treasure hunter named Krzysztof Szpakowski recently said. He'd been looking for the hidden treasure since he was old enough to legally buy alcohol. He said years back when he first started looking, he interviewed some old German folks who lived in a small village not far from one of the tunnels. They all told him the same thing. Over a couple days in 1945, German soldiers marched into the village and told everyone to close their curtains and stay inside. They warned that anyone who looked out the window would be shot on the spot. The next thing they knew was the sound of a truck convoy rattling through the village. Szpakowski said the trucks were heading for one complex of tunnels called the Waldasz Complex. He believed that this had been built at first as a hiding place for only the highest-ranking Nazis, but they later decided that the complex would become a depository for precious goods, perhaps arms, but more likely loot. What better place to hide it? Something similar is written in a book called The Mysteries of the WWII Undergrounds. The author writes that over a few days at the end of the war, long convoys of trucks drove through the town, and not one of them came back. He says the trucks were hidden in a tunnel, after which the Germans blew up the entrance and planted vegetation around it. Even with modern technology, finding a hole in the ground that's hidden somewhere over a large area is not easy at all. Even when a new tunnel is found, the treasure hunters usually end up in a vast space full of endless opportunities to explore. One dead end could just mean the start of another series of tunnels. As the journalist for The New Yorker said, like a lottery ticket, each tunnel sparks a new dream, and every treasure hunter seems to have his own wish list. Gold, jewels, artwork, and an underground train terminal, or a supercomputer prototype. Then again, did the Red Army clean up after the war was over? Did the Soviets take a lot more trophies than the rest of the world knew about? Or did US intelligence make some deals and run off with the swag? Was there any swag in the first place? Some people think not. Or at least they say what loot is there has been greatly exaggerated. Still, in 2018, something happened that showed people anything could be down in those tunnels. That's because while looking for the gold train in Lower Silesia, Polish treasure hunters said they had found 4 tons of gold, 10 feet below a disused 18th century palace, a place reportedly used by the Nazis as a brothel. This happened after decades of treasure hunters had been looking high and low for the train and treasure chests. The group that founded the Silesian Bridge Foundation said the gold was hidden inside a buried canister. Still, when reports surfaced, it seemed the canister had yet to be checked, as there was a concern it was booby-trapped. We're still not sure what happened here as the media didn't update the report. The hunters used an SS diary they had been given to derive clues about the hidden treasure, and they later scanned the ground using radar technology. One of the lead hunters told the press, "Our information says that this particular deposit was hidden by an SS officer called von Stein. The SS planned to use it to re-establish agriculture in Ukraine to feed the new Reich." He said the same diary points to a lot more hidden gold, as well as art, jewelry, and religious artifacts, all hidden at sites throughout Lower Silesia. Part of one of the diary entries read, "The remaining 48 heavy Reichsbank chests and all the family chests I hereby entrust to you. Only you know where they're located. May God help you and help me fulfill my assignment." It also mentions 47 works of art, with names such as Monet, Cézanne, and Rembrandt popping up on the pages. The Silesian Bridge Foundation says the diary was written by an SS officer who used the possibly fake name Michaelis. He talks about 11 different sites where the treasure is buried, including the mega amount of gold bullion taken from the Reichsbank. The diary itself had for years been kept at a Masonic lodge, one that in the past was frequented by wealthy members of the Third Reich. It seems the newer members of the lodge had wanted it off their hands and so recently handed it over to the foundation. Even if you don't believe the tons of gold and cash are somewhere under the ground, many of the 5 million European artworks that the Nazis had stole have not been recovered. It's thought that 63,000 works of art and valuable cultural items stolen from Polish Jews alone are still either hidden or secretly owned by people who don't want to return them. Still, again, we have to say that people might be getting carried away with their hunt for Nazi gold. For example, it was believed for a long time that 4 tons of the stuff was aboard the SS Minden when it was sunk off the coast of Iceland in 1939. That story goes that the German captain sank the ship himself rather than let it fall into the hands of the approaching British. A subsequent theory said that it contained all the gold, and perhaps more valuable items. But when the wreck was finally explored in 2018, no gold or other precious things could be found. So is the gold still hidden? Or like many of the valuable works of art, did some of it find its way into someone's basement? Was the money spent years ago? Or is there a train somewhere beneath Poland that carries a fortune, buried under many tons of soil and enslaved people's blood? We don't know, but if we lived in Lower Silesia, we'd be out exploring next weekend. Now, you need to watch How Rich Was Hitler? Where did all his money come from? Or have a look at this.